Good afternoon. We'll call the meeting to order. Everybody's here. First order of business is public comment. Anybody wishing to speak, please approach at this time.
Hi, I'm Deborah McLean. I'm the publisher of the Banana Peel, and I respectfully request that, similar to Kathy McGrath's letter, that my Banana Peel, where Wayne Daltrey wrote an extensive study of the Baracco report, be added into the next DRGR packet as substantial evidence. Thank you so much, and here's a copy.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Andy Tilton for the record. One of the things I noticed in one of the pieces of literature I was reading was an alternative that came out of the 2009 update, I believe, to the South Lee County Watershed Plan. There was a storage plan. And the numbers to me were kind of interesting in that it said there was a need for 10,000 acre feet of storage, which would be about 10 feet deep on 1,000 acres, or roughly 2 sections of land, with a 20-foot high dike to give you some freeboard around it for storing that 10 feet of water against storms, moving the water around and running it over the top of the dike that you might not want. And the other interesting part that I thought was the size of the pump that it was going to take to move that water was 1,000 CFS. 1,000 CFS doesn't sound like a lot until it gets converted into gallons per minute. So it's just under 500,000 gallons per minute, about 449,000 gallons per minute, which is a pretty good sized pump considering that our local water plant is between 10 and 20 million gallons a day, and that number converts to about 640 or 650 million gallons per day. And then this would be a facility that would only be needed in large storm events. So to me, it is probably the reason that study did not push it any further, because it's very expensive for a very, very few times that it would ever get used. So as you're looking at those things, I just encourage you to look at the overall cost and the return on investment of that cost. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Donna Stone. I live at Worthington Country Club and am on their External Affairs Committee. I don't envy your yeoman's task of pulling all of this information together. Just in this agenda, you have Roger Cobb, you have the South Lee County Watershed Plan update, the DHI hydrology study of the DRGR, and the Bonita Springs Stormwater Master Plan. I respectfully ask that Kevin Irwin receive all of this information where we've hired him as a consultant so that he is able to look over the information that these professionals are also providing and to be able to decide whether some of the information is a little out of skew or whether it's right on, or whether their plan as far as the future is in the scope of what we're looking for. And also, at the last city council meeting, Bonita Springs voted the first reading of the Bonita Spring Comprehensive Plan update on their Florida water management. Now, that also could be in conflict with everything that we're trying to look at for the DRGR. So again, could Kevin Irwin please get a copy of this report also so that he has all of the information where we've hired him as an expert. And I would caution the city in putting anything into their plan that could be in conflict with the scope of what we're trying to accomplish in the DRGR area. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else for public comment? All right, seeing none, we're going to move on I understand that Roger is stuck in traffic. Yeah, so we're going to shift things around a little bit here. Oh, we got to approve the minutes. Sorry. John, you've got on here approve for signature only for the February 3rd, 18th, and 3rd.
No,
February 3rd.
Actually, I thought we had changed that agenda.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I
That's
looking at
okay.
the old one?
Yeah.
My bad.
That was a draft that we were working on, but this
Oh,
agenda
sorry. Okay,
includes-
March 24th agenda.
There you go.
Or minutes. Anybody have any comments to those?
I've got a couple comments, I think just some minor corrections, but I would say that these are the best minutes that we've ever received, and I appreciate really the detail that is in this, because this is very comprehensive, so I appreciate that. On page 2, in the middle of that, there was, about the middle of the page, it talks about committee member Gilkey. He said he went through where it says reverse osmosis. The wording of that just got messed up a little bit. The Water Management District said only more, and that the word much bugged him. That was me. So it's not worded very well at the end of, that's all. My point was that the district said it costs more, but not much more, and that was the gist of that comment. So then on page 3 at the top, I think we clarified at the end of the first paragraph there where it said we had clarified that on page 4 it was Mr. Where it said Mr. Parton was not a genealogist, the statement really was from Mr. Pass that Mr. Irwin was not a geologist, and so it just didn't come out right there. So, and in the middle of that, where committee member Bonita said page 5 at the top, I'm not sure I understand that sentence. Maybe that, Tori, I don't know if you could clarify what you meant by that statement. A lot of water flow there, and they exceeded in getting that area? Exceeded?
I think it was supposed to be succeeded.
Succeeded?
Yeah.
So instead of exceeded, succeeded?
Or I think it says that. And then the following sentence says she thinks it is succeeded in getting
So maybe
that
it says
area.
it twice?
Right.
Okay.
Well,
Maybe it
originally
says
the
it
minute said exceeded, and she thinks it's supposed to be succeeded.
And then on page 4, in that second paragraph down, it says either Fowler property and Fowler public. What was that?
I marked that too. I was not sure what that,
Not sure what that was supposed to
I
be.
think that's supposed to be fallow.
Fallow as in
I
fallow
think
land?
Fallow land. I
okay.
think that's
So
what I
fallow-
had, but
Like fallow agricultural land?
Correct.
Fallow. Okay, fallow.
I had that one too.
Is somebody making these corrections?
yeah,
And then also on that same page, just where it talks about, second paragraph up, Mr. Feeney, the 9,903 pounds, that is pounds per year. So that 9,903 pounds would be pounds per year.
that's on page 3.
On page 4.
I
page
think the
4.
9,900, that's the, Todd, I think it was 3,000.
It was 3,000
Per
over
year.
per year
So-
for the 5 years, but the 9,900 pounds is continuous when you get to that point.
Oh, okay.
I think that's correct.
I think it's
That's there's a couple other the last page 7, Jim Beaver with a V instead of B is in the 4th paragraph down, and then on the 5th paragraph down there is last sentence talks about hybrid soils, and I think that should be hydric, not hybrid.
Yep.
And other than that, Missimer is spelled wrong, and I think that's all I've got really.
I have a few as well, but anybody else?
I do.
Okay, on page 3, middle of the page where it talks Vice Chair Johnson requested Paul Pascho as absent. Councilmember Gallagher stated, I think it was me who stated that. And then the motion as well, Committee Member Gallagher made a motion to approve the minutes as amended. I think, again, that was me. Page 6, the last paragraph, it talks about fill flood, the second line. Much of the area was constructed prior to the lavatory program,
Yeah, I wondered.
which would great. It was actually the regulatory program.
Okay.
I think the lavatory program is a different committee. On page 7, the first paragraph, final sentence says the 15-year pro limit, that should be program. And then in the second paragraph, third to the last line, it says identifying body max and identify specific project, that should be bottlenecks. So, I think that's all I had.
And I had, let's see, on page 3, the third complete paragraph that starts March 3rd, 2014, in the second to the last line, says, and there's really no difference between the Lee County DRGR and Bonita DRGR, and he later conceded on that. And I think everyone else got my other corrections, so that's the only new one.
All right, so Cullum, you moved to approve, well, you moved originally to approve. Do we want to amend the motion to include the notes?
Included the corrections.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. All right, so Roger's here, made it through the traffic. Excellent.
We may need a little time to set up. Roger indicated he's got a PowerPoint that he
Okay.
wanted to show, and we might be having some difficulty getting that going.
Okay. Do we want to, I mean, if we start getting into the studies, it's going to take forever. Do we want to
I have
start?
something little to say.
Perfect.
I found out who the Kiel Canal was named after.
Me too.
Did you?
Yeah, finally.
William Kiel.
They say the same thing.
Yeah.
William Kiel, in the mid-1950s, there were 4 major property owners in the DRGR area: the Alico Inc., Pioneer Game Farms, the William Kiel, who the Bonita Kiel Canal still drains the Flint Penn Strand, and Consolidated Naval Stores Company. So now we know it was named after one of the 4 large property owners in the
And I'm
DRGR
curious,
in the
was that
1950s.
thanks to our, now I'm forgetting his name, the Spotlight?
No, I actually Googled it and found that it was written in this agricultural conservation and residential lands, and then I found his name within that
Oh, right,
article
good,
about it,
yeah,
so
that's- I think
kind of
that's-
just did a little, I did call a few people that had lived out there for a long time, but nobody knew why, so I Googled it enough times till I found it.
Yeah, I Googled it too and didn't find it, but then I found out that the gentleman from Spotlight, what's his name again?
Peter. O'Flynn.
Peter O'Flynn, I found out that he had written about it somewhere.
Oh,
You're going to have to speak into the...
Yeah, excuse me.
anyway, I was
Anyways,
excited about that.
Babbling a little about the source of the information. Peter O'Flynn had given it to Charlie Whitehead. Charlie let me know about it, and it's interesting. We did get some info on it, and that's great. It's I'd be curious to read I'd like to read a little biographical information on him in one of these days, but maybe we'll find that too. Anyway, thanks to everybody who looked.
So now we can say Tori is a genealogist. We needed a genealogist, apparently, and it's Tori. Excellent.
Is that easy?
Yeah, that's good.
We all set, or are we still?
We're ready.
Perfect.
Good afternoon. My name is Roger Kopp. I work for ADA Engineering, and thank you for allowing me to come and talk with you today.
There's Peter.
Trying to figure out what's going on with the slides, why they keep forwarding all by themselves. So what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about some of the things that I said to council back in October. I've added a few thoughts to the presentation, couple slides, and then if there's any questions at all that any of you might have about some of the work that we've done for South Florida Water Management District, I'll be happy to address any of those questions. This really is on a schedule of its own. We were hired by South Florida.
What's flipping away?
We have a computer whiz in the house.
I'll just keep on backing it up, I guess. we were hired by South Florida Water Management District to look into the South Lee County Watershed Plan update, or South Lee County Watershed Plan area. And the purpose of the study was basically to evaluate whether or not additional culverts should be placed underneath I-75 in the Halfway Creek area that's up by the Brooks. I'm sure everybody here knows where the Brooks is. The purpose of that, the reason why they wanted to ask that question was that there was some work that was done. It's called the South Lee County Watershed Plan. That plan was developed after some pretty major floods in the 1990s. And there was a series of recommendations that came out of that plan, and one of the recommendations that had not been implemented was to put additional culverts underneath I-75 with the purpose of putting more water through Halfway Creek, because Halfway Creek was noted during one of the prior larger floods to not have a whole lot of water in it, yet the Imperial River had quite a bit of water in it, and there was flooding in Bonita Springs. And the modeling work that was done at that point in time suggested that if you put the additional culverts underneath I-75 at Halfway Creek, it would take water away from the Imperial River and decrease flooding. And so that was the purpose of the question. We did the work. We came up with a report. The findings were somewhat controversial. Our findings did not indicate that putting additional culverts underneath I-75 would be beneficial. There was quite a bit of arguing about that, the final report stayed in a draft format for quite a while things were worked out. Finally, the report was adopted and approved by Lee County and South Florida Water Management District, and a separate document was released in 2010 with the final recommendations. So, yeah, just leave it like that, and then we'll just kind of go through.
Got the timing set on it.
Oh, was there time? Yeah. Okay. All right. Hopefully that'll. Okay. So, what do we think? Are we all right now? Not so sure. Yeah, let's just do it manual. We'll take it out of presentation mode, and I'll advance it as. See, I think if I do this, yeah, there we go. Got it. There you go. Got it. Okay, good deal. Okay, so I think I talked about the study objectives. The study area includes all of the drainage area to the Estero River, to Halfway Creek, and to the Imperial River. It did not include the Cocohatchee Canal, which is south of the Imperial River. And we use boundary conditions to define what the interchanges would be there. And what we found was that, just like in the prior study, we confirmed that there wasn't enough flow going to the Estero River and Halfway Creek. There's an area east of the Brooks, east of I-75, but sort of along the southern end, that I think probably historically was the headwaters of Spring Creek, where there our biologist that was part of the team identified that the wetlands there seemed to be wetter than the wetlands up towards the Estero River, and that if we could wave a magic wand, it would be beneficial to move water out of the south end of that wetland area somewhere, because the wetlands there were experiencing longer periods of inundation than was felt to be natural. And of course, we found that there was some flooding in Spring Creek, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody down here. And part of the problems with the flooding were we're both east of 41, well, east of Old 41 and a little bit west of Old 41. There's a railroad line, I guess it's an abandoned railroad line west of Old 41 that has some really small culverts underneath the railroad line, and it's all blocked up with a lot of vegetation, or at least it was at the time. I haven't followed up to find out whether or not any of those problems have been fixed. And then, of course, you know about the flooding problems in the Kiel Canal area, east of Bonita, or is it, let's see, Boca Grande Drive, I believe it is. Pardon? Bonita Grande, okay, Bonita Grande. And then, of course, the Quinn Dean Street area. There were a couple of other small places where we saw some flooding problems as well that were addressed in your 2010 Stormwater Master Plan. So I mentioned that it was, I guess it was 2011, early 2011, when Lee County and South Florida finally adopted the plan recommendations. So one of the things that we looked at was putting trying to get some water from that south area of wetlands east of the brooks over into the Spring Creek area to augment base flows. We were pretty cautious about those recommendations because certainly there are areas east of US 41, San Carlos Estates, that they don't need any extra water during the wet season. But there are times when we heard from a number of different people during the study that it would be nice to have additional flows through Spring Creek. And so our thought process was make the connection, have a gated connection, and when Spring Creek wanted water and there was extra water east of 75, you open up the gates and let the water go. That was our recommendation there. We did recommend also that some culverts be replaced underneath old US 41, underneath that old railroad embankment. So those were some of the recommendations related to Spring Creek. A map showing where these structures are. And then one of the other recommendations that we made was to try to advance something that was being considered at the time as part of a development on the eastern edge of Bonita Beach Road to make a connection between the Imperial River and the Cocache Canal, which was compromised through a series of developments south of Bonita Beach Road, east of 75. And that arrow shows where right here, where the conveyance would be, and it's approximately right where that arrow was shown. There was a flowway that was proposed as part of a development. I don't think that's moved forward. Am I correct that tract hasn't been developed yet?
John's here, so it's in the process of being
And
developed.
did that get taken out of the plans that establishing that flowway?
There's a flowway.
There is a flowway. Nice. Way to go.
John's good like that.
But it's not a full flowway.
Okay.
It's not going to get the capacity you probably want.
All right. Well, anyways, that was a recommendation that we made. And then I made a couple of personal comments at the last time I was down here. And they were my comments. They weren't the Water Management District comments. They weren't ADA engineering comments. They were my professional opinions. Because there's been a change in land use conditions in the DRGR area, there's less floodplain storage. There's less wetland storage than there used to be. And I think that additional storage is needed. And there's a number of possible benefits that you would see from from storing additional water. That water could be available for groundwater recharge. It could be available for wetlands. It could be available for public water supply. It could be available for supplying base flows to streams during the later part of the wet season, early part of the dry season. There's a fair number of creeks that don't have as much flow as we'd like to see as we move into the dry season, and having some additional storage would help. And it's consistent with how that area east of 75 was back before the land was altered. I mean, it was always wet. There was always a lot of wetlands out there. And so it would be consistent with the pre-development condition. There is a fair amount of flooding east of I-75. And I think that that sometimes when land is sold down here, and somebody moves from down north and they buy a tract of land, they buy it right around now when the conditions are great. It's spring break. Let's take a trip down to Florida. Honey, wouldn't it be great to retire down here? And go take a look at a piece of land, and it looks great, and you buy it, and then 6 months later you come down and it's a lake. It happens all the time. I personally have talked with real estate guys that tell me that's best time to sell land. If you take a look at this flooding map from the 2010 Bonita Springs Stormwater Master Plan, which I believe was adopted by City Council here, everything that's blue, or sort of turquoise looking on this screen here, is wet. And this is for a 10-year flood. This is something that happens once every 10 years. And you can see that there's a lot of water. Bonita Beach Road there is identified. And the area that's just north of Bonita Beach Road, there's a lot of flooding there. And if you take a look at the, zoom in on it, you know, that flooding is in areas where there's developments, where there's people trying to live. You take a look at the 25-year, it's even worse. Basically, everything north of Bonita Beach Road at that point is a lake. There's a few areas of dry land. Much of the development north of Bonita Beach Road is inundated, according to your approved map. And so there are residents south of Bonita Beach Road in a 25-year storm that have water in their driveways and the streets. And I think the flooding, from what I've heard from talking to people that live down there, is more frequent than once every 25 years. So I think one of the things you have to understand is anything that you are considering in terms of development east of I-75, you have to expect that there's going to be a lot of water to deal with. Now, that's both a problem and an opportunity, and it just depends upon how that development proceeds. So just something to keep in mind. This figure shows the northeast quadrant study area. It shows the flooding according to our simulated simulation results, and the flooding goes on for months. I took a look at flows over the past 8-10 years, and you can see this is the Kiel Canal gate, and the blue line is upstream and the red line is downstream, and these are water levels. And you can see during the wet years in 2006 and 2008 and 2009 and 2010 and 2011 that the upstream and the downstream water levels are the same. Basically, that structure is drowned out. There's water everywhere, and it goes on for months. So just something to keep in mind. And you know, I recommend that you guys, you know, recognize that area will flood, and that any proposals that are being considered by the city east of 75 factor that in. And I just personally, I recommend that you do what you can to incorporate as much storage as you can that is centralized storage, not in the center of the development, but put all the storage in one place. So at some point in the future, should you decide that you want more storage, you don't have houses interlaced between these little lakes and stuff like you have south of Bonita Beach Road. You couldn't add more water to those ponds south of Bonita Beach Road east of 75 because there's houses and golf courses and stuff all around. There is the map up there shows that the mines are on the east side, and then there's some sort of development on the west side of that study area there. If you could concentrate as much of the storage on the east side, that gives you the option later on. If you say, you know what, it would be good to have more water, then you can change the configuration of how you store that water, and you can store it deeper. You can incorporate that into other projects, and that gives you more flexibility to adapt as things change in the future. So that's basically all I was planning to say. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know a little bit about the other studies that have been done. I've reviewed the 2010 study. There's also work that was done as part of Southern Crew that used the Mike Shee, Mike 11 model that was similar to the model that we used. I'm familiar with the modeling work that was done there. So I'd be happy to comment on any of those studies should you have any questions. And so with that, I'll stop talking, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
I have a question. When you talk about water storage in this area, and I've been reading about this 1,000 acres, 10 feet deep, sounds a little bit to me like a lake, bermed, and when it's that deep and it's used to draining its natural drainage where it dries this time of year, and we're going to artificially keep it wet, what happens to the wading birds that are, the cycle of life out there is not a wet lake all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we're altering it. Am I correct in that you're saying to alter it in a wetter way rather than, maybe on the East Coast, they've drained it all and altered it in a drier way, but it's not normally bermed, diked, and holding 10 feet deep of water there. That's the part that I'm having trouble wrapping. And I might just be misinterpreting this. I hadn't really heard, other than the fact that it had been rejected earlier as an option, 1,000 acres of what do you mean by storage?
Well, the thought process is, and first of all, 10 feet deep is not is not a recommendation per se. What we did was we did a simulation where we said, okay, let's say you wanted to solve the flooding problems in Quinn Street. We set up a way to move that water over to that mining area, recognizing it was a hypothetical scenario, and so that would basically become a storage area for that excess water to try to alleviate some of the flooding problems. I think a 10-foot deep reservoir in lime rock areas like we have down here can be problematic, 10 feet above prevailing water table, because seepage happens, and there isn't anything you can do to stop that. But the thought process would be that in the wet season you would put water there that would otherwise be causing flooding problems. And you're essentially compensating for the lack of floodplain storage that exists in the residential areas that are part of Bonita Springs and other communities in the area. And then as the dry season moves on, that water is then used for some purpose or another, and the water level would gradually drop, and would probably, typically you would expect that the pond or lake or reservoir or whatever you want to call it would be back to normal normal water levels that are prevailing in the area. So it'd probably be below normal ground elevation by now. Mm-hmm. That water would be used up. It would be used for a number of different purposes. So it's not like it's going to be kept 10 feet deep 365 days of the year. And there are reservoirs all over the state that operate in that way. I mean, we have areas of ponded water in the DRG area. You just look at the map and you can see them all.
Right.
There's Harns Marsh and Lehigh Acres, and there are birds there, and the water levels go up and down in Harns Marsh, and the birds still keep coming.
So then the proposal would be the acquisition of, for example, 1,000 acres that is in private property right now, and turning that into this publicly owned land that would become Bonita Springs Reservoir, for lack of better. Okay.
Yep.
Oh, go ahead.
How effective would it be if it were smaller than that 1,000 acres? That would be the ideal. Would there be a benefit in having a series of smaller reservoirs? Could it still be effective if there was a 700-acre piece or a 500-acre piece? Is this something that the benefits increase the more land area you have participating, but it still could be beneficial on a smaller scale?
Yeah, there's nothing magic about 1,000 acres, nothing at all. It was just it was an alternative that we identified as part of the stakeholder participation process of the South Lee County Watershed Plan update, and that's what we evaluated as part of that alternative. Does it have to be 1,000 acres? No. Could it be 100 acres? Sure. Would it be better at 1,000 than 100? Yes. But that doesn't mean that a 100-acre storage reservoir would be bad. What I'm saying is that in terms of if you take a look at the loss of floodplain storage, 1,000 acres, 10 feet deep is a drop in the bucket. Okay? That isn't to say you have to have it, but you've lost a lot of floodplain storage in this watershed, and 10,000 acre feet is nothing. It's a drop in the bucket.
Question?
Please.
Okay.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I enjoyed your presentation very much, found it very useful. The question I have now is, with all these recommendations that you've made, what is the status of them? Have you done any follow-up? How many have been implemented or funded, or are they just ignored and they're sitting on a bookshelf somewhere?
Well, because I'm a private consultant, it's not my job to continue to monitor the progress of recommendations that we would have made to South Florida Water Management District. I would like to have the luxury of being able to keep track of it all, because I've worked in this area doing hydrologic restoration for years, and it's something where, you know, it's more than just a job to me, but I have not tracked everything. I do know that with regard to the Estero River and Halfway Creek, that there have been improvements that have been made there. We made a recommendation that debris be moved out of Halfway Creek west of US 41. There was a lot of Melaleuca at the time that we did the study in Halfway Creek west of 41. That's been removed. When the Melaleuca was removed in prior years, what they did is they basically chopped the trees down, piled them up, and left them sitting there. We said, get them out of the floodplain because of the loss of floodplain storage. We know that recommendation has been implemented, and there have been improvements there. We know that another recommendation that we made is that water from the brooks, there's a gate that diverts water along Three Oaks Parkway up towards the south branch of the Estero River. The channel that is on the east side of Three Oaks Parkway, the channel had a weir put in it at one point for a wetland mitigation thing, which basically rendered the diversion structure, which was supposed to have a capacity of 160 CFS, rendered that not useless, but much less effective. We recommended that conveyance be restored to its original design purpose. We know that work has been done. It was funded by FDOT. We also recommended that Melaleuca be removed from the south branch of the Estero River between I-75 and Three Oaks Parkway. Again, FDOT funded that restoration work, and the Melaleuca has been removed, and it's much more of a natural conveyance in the south branch of the Estero River. So we do know that certain recommendations have been made. I haven't kept track of all of them. I don't know the status of
Well, the
what's going
question
on
is,
in
where,
Spring
from
Creek.
being on the task force, where should we go? Who should we talk to find out about the status of the recommendations?
Well, I would think that Spring Creek, I believe, is within the city, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
Spring Creek, the recommendations we made for Spring Creek, that's within city limits, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And so I would think that you guys would know about that. I haven't tracked that one. That's one that I haven't followed up on. I definitely think that, work needs to be done in the Spring Creek watershed. But I'm sorry, I can't tell you what's been done. Certainly, Phil Flood's in the back of the room here. He's got staff that work on approving permits. If there's any work that would have been done in the Spring Creek watershed of that nature that we recommended, I would think that his permitting department would know about it. I checked a while back, and there was nothing about a year ago.
Well, perhaps John might be able to jump in there and have some ideas about who we should talk to and ask for information about the status of these recommendations.
Well, actually, I think you heard a little bit about what Matt Feeney and Public Works were planning for those areas last time, and we can follow up in more detail.
I thought I saw in our packet a list of things that had been completed, those that were in process, and that you sent us just.
Yeah, that was out of the Baraka report that Greg Stewart gave us
Oh,
a couple
okay.
meetings back, yeah.
Right.
A list of
Because I was just
things.
looking at that list of what had been.
Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't answer your question, sir.
It's a loaded question, I'm sorry.
Okay, sorry.
May I ask you another question regarding the Melaleuca? I
Sure.
was just out in East Bonita the other day, and there is presently, I don't know if it's Water Management or Conservation 2020 land, but there are new trees, Melaleuca, being cut and treated. I think they're poisoning them. But they either ring them and spray something that they die on them, and then they leave them fall. They just lay there. Is that not the best? They're not stacking them, they're just down.
Just letting them fall, right. Well, the area that you're referring to is east of Kiel Canal, north of Bonita Beach Road, right? That's not a flowway that has the sort of velocities.
It's
that-
north of the Kiel Canal, not east of it. It's east of Bonita Grande.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
all right. The area in Halfway Creek that I was referring to, west of 41, all the discharges in Halfway Creek are confined to this one relatively narrow flow pathway. Okay, and in that particular circumstance, the Melaleuca was a greater impact upon the flow because the velocities were higher. To my understanding, the area that you're talking about, and I'm not exactly sure where it is, but I know enough about that area that my guess is the velocities that we're talking about out there are sufficiently low that I don't think removal is necessary. Removal
Okay.
really amps up the cost of the exotics removal, and so killing them is better than doing nothing.
Right.
And in an area where the velocities are relatively low, where the water is basically just laying there and hanging
It's
around
a
for a while.
gradual sheet flow area
Yeah,
over the.
that's not a problem.
It comes down into the 2020 land and then down towards the Y.
Yeah, I wouldn't
And into the Kiel
think
Canal.
that it would be absolutely necessary
Okay,
to
I
remove
was
the
just
trees
curious. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I've got,
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Fred, Dennis has
okay.
been pretty patient.
Well,
Go ahead.
I had three areas of questions. One, on the Spring Creek, I didn't realize that it was a gated recommendation for that. Did you have, out of the $10.3 million of the recommended plan, did you have a breakdown of that cost, that specific area? Because I haven't been able to find that anywhere.
Yeah, I'm the little hard drive in my head is clicking away here. I think so. There was for each item there was a breakdown. I do quite a bit of work for East County Water Control District and Lehigh Acres, and typically they're spending somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 to $400,000. But they're typically higher flows than what we're talking about here. But I'd be happy to check before we leave the meeting. I've got my computer here. I can check and find out what that price is.
Okay, thank you.
But I
And-
assumed.
Yeah, because it seems like that keeps coming up, and as far as that cost and whether that could be funded or how it's funded, I guess that matters. The second question on the storage.
Oh, sir, can I just make one small comment? The putting the extra culverts in underneath I-75 at Halfway Creek, That was going to cost DOT like $1.5 million or something like that. And they've spent maybe a couple $100,000 on exotics removal. And they've got that money sitting in a little pot, waiting for somebody to ask them for that money.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't have to pay for that yourself.
My understanding was, and Phil's here, and he can confirm this, but my understanding, that money was committed to the control structure modifications at Three Oaks from the DOT to spend theirs, but we can confirm that.
Yeah, maybe they spent the rest of the money there, and they feel like they've satisfied their commitments. I'm sorry.
On the storage, in all cases, what you're talking about is pump storage? You know, basically you'd pump and build up
Yes,
the
sir.
water?
Yep.
With dikes and everything? Okay.
Yep.
And I can only assume the reason it wasn't one of the recommendations of the update was that it cost 5 times the recommended alternative of 50-something million versus 10 or so?
Oh, it's definitely very, very expensive. There's no question about it. Okay, but there, in all cases that I'm aware of, where they have made that initial investment, they've never said to themselves afterwards, "Man, why did we spend that money? That was dumb money."
Probably maintenance, you know, something like that, what, 10% a year, so maybe $5 million a year in maintenance, of operating and maintenance maybe?
I'd have to, I wouldn't want to talk about that. I have, but I could, you know, if you want an opinion on maintenance, I could give you.
Well, it
I have-
just seems like that's as big an issue as the capital cost when you get into those kind of pumps and
Pumps are expensive.
structures.
And they're expensive to
berms
operate, and you got to make sure they continue to operate. Go out there once every
Yeah.
week or two and turn them on and off, and you know, control exotics on the berms, and
Yep.
yeah.
The last thing I'll just, and if you bear with me, I'm going to give you a copy. I had tried to figure out on your map, if you go back to the map on the simulated water levels, I'll take it. I tried to rectify where that line was in the
This map here, or the
DRGR. Yeah, and the map I'm giving you shows what I think is the correct line of the DRGR, Bonita, which is the red line. So I'm not sure. Did you get yours? Okay, sorry. I'm not sure, but I'd ask you to double check that, because I think your line is off on the limits of the Bonita DRGR on that simulated map, or the simulated water level map. I tried to rectify where roads and flowways were and stuff like that, and the red line is what I came up with based on the scale of your map, which was
I
probably.
don't believe I show on that map the limits of the DRGR area. I
So
think
that
I was
black
out.
line, is that not the east, you labeled it northeast quadrant study area?
There's an area that you guys are looking at as a potential area for development.
Well, no, the whole area that we're looking at is the 5,000 acres I have limited, shown in the red line.
Okay.
Yours looks to be about half of that.
Well, if the line is incorrect, my apologies.
I don't know how it affects your study. It's just, when I saw that, I tried to rectify where things were in it, and this is what I came up with anyway.
It wasn't like that line was a focus area of our study. The work we did was in 2008, 2009, and this issue wasn't presented, and so it's just a line I drew around that was my
Okay.
best guess
Okay.
of what I thought your study area is, and if I'm wrong with that, I apologize.
Fred?
Yeah, I've got a number of questions, but before I get into them on this, just curiosity, the blue represents what? Because I've been out there and seen water all the way over the interstate.
He's got the,
I mean, what size storm creates this map? I guess that's what I'm asking.
That was a map just basically representing a single day in the fall of 2006 when water levels were high.
Okay.
And there's a depth chart that's shown on the lower right-hand corner of the graph that
Gotcha.
represents the depth for that. It's about 1 to 2 foot of water, that medium blue color.
Yeah.
Yeah, we
The,
don't have that chart on here.
Yeah.
Specifically,
oh,
here's
it's on
some
your
que-
base report.
here's
on
some
his slide.
questions that, here are questions that I wanted to ask you.
I don't
Number
have that.
one,
In the report
what
itself.
was
in
the
here.
approximate storm event size of like the 95, the 05, and the 08 floods we had? Do you happen to know? And if you don't, is that something you can easily get back to us?
Yeah, I believe that information is available. I remember reading a report. I believe, but I'd have to check on my computer.
Okay, yeah.
But I could get back to you on that.
Fine, okay. The next thing is that didn't the original earlier study, which yours was the follow-on too, which I think was something like 1999,
I believe
wasn't one of their primary recommendations was large storage reservoirs? I believe it was.
Again, my memory fails me on that one,
Okay.
and I would have to check it. I have that report on my computer, and I could pretty quickly get that answer for you.
Right.
But I don't remember that off the top of my head.
Okay. The, if wouldn't an additional benefit of the large storage be that you would reduce the pollutants going into the creeks and the rivers and
Yes.
all that?
Mhm. Yep.
And in the work you've done, and apparently you know a lot about the large storage, there are sources of funding that you could get that would actually help pay for that, some of that cost, aren't there?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's a leprechaun sitting around waiting to give you money or anything, but there are. I know the restore money is, people have been applying for that, and that I know Berry Grove's Reservoir and a number of dispersed water management storage projects are hoping to take advantage of some of that restore money. You know, and in Lehigh Acres and East County Water Control District, I would say over half to 2/3 of the money that has been spent there in implementing projects that were part of a comprehensive plan that we were part of, and a couple other firms were part of as well. Back, the plan was developed in 2007. Over 2/3 of the money has been grant money.
I follow up on a question you had, Fred, because I was going to hand it out in a bit, but the 99 study did recommend storage, but it recommended crew and water management district purchases, which are being and have been done.
Right.
And I'd like to ask a question that the 65,000 acre crew, if you put 10,000 acre feet on that, it's 2 inches.
Oh, I
Doesn't it
agree.
make more sense to get 2 inches on that land that we've already bought than trying to pay $50 million for plus all the maintenance and everything? I mean, doesn't that make more sense?
One of the ideas that was bandied about, we did not evaluate the alternative, but we at least considered it, was some sort of way to slow down the movement of water into the Kiel Canal from north and east of Kiel Canal, and that was something that we talked about, but it was never formally adopted as an alternative that we would consider. But you're absolutely right, sir. You could store just as much water there, potentially at lower cost. At the time we were doing the work, there was still quite a bit of land in private ownership north of Kiel Canal, and it really complicated that alternative at the time. Today, because of the work that the Water Management District has done, excellent work, shall I say, on Southern Crew, it's an easier recommendation to consider. And I think that if we were looking at it today, it probably would have made it into the short list of alternatives to be considered.
May I ask a question regarding that?
Sure.
In some of the other areas within the state that have implemented this concept, has the land acquisition been contiguous, and has it been willing seller, or have those areas moved into acquisition through eminent domain?
Yes and no. Let's take a look at the Berry Groves Reservoir, which is a project that's the best example of shovel-ready projects to, quick start the economy. I mean, there's a project that's designed, permitted, plans are sitting there right on the shelf. All you have to do is call up the newspaper and say, we're looking for bids. That land was purchased from a willing seller. In Picayune Strand Restoration Project south of us, most of the land was willing seller. I was involved in an eminent domain case down there for a 160-acre tract. That was pretty interesting situation. So it's not always willing seller. But I think willing seller is way better than eminent domain. Eminent domain, you spend a bunch of money on lawyers and you end up,
Right.
paying dearly for the property.
And we have a pretty bad taste in our mouths, those of, like me, who are residents of East Bonita, from the Southern Crew. And although it's been effective and we try to be forgiving, a lot of people out there suffered and continued to suffer, and family members, et cetera. So this is one thing that I have been bringing up a lot to the group, and that is, and to the city. Are we talking about eminent domain? And are we, we need to know going into this, if that's what that's what's being talked about here. That
Right.
should be out there on the microphone and on the tape, because
Right. Yeah, no, it's a.
that's when I first started hearing this, I thought, which 1,000 acres and who's planning on selling? Because I hadn't heard about it. So anyway, that's just, not trying to be difficult, it just is difficult.
One of the biggest challenges with Southern Crew was, trying to acquire a relatively contiguous area of land where, when you implemented the restoration, it didn't negatively affect private landowners, and that was one of their biggest challenges. It's been a challenging project because of. I would say that's been one of their larger challenges.
Well, it negatively affected everyone who lost their home and their property.
Mhm.
That wasn't willing and got moved out, especially when they looked on the south side of the road and saw the development.
Right.
So what we're really looking at is trading off somebody's dream for somebody else's idea, unless it's willing seller, which is a whole different.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
How would additional water in those crew areas impact the habitat there? Is that an area that is currently water starved, where in the concept of 2 inches within that area, how would that impact it hydrologically and habitat and vegetative community?
What I like to do is I like to work with smart, experienced biologists like Kevin Irwin, who I work with in concert, and we establish hydroperiod restoration targets. And we say, in the wet season, I want it to be this deep. And in the dry season, I want it to be that deep. And I want it to gradually go, and so we set these targets. And that's what we did in Picayune Strand, where we set these hydroperiod restoration targets. And then in that area, there were landowners where north of 75 that were going to stay there. And so in that project, we put in pump stations, and the pump station turned on, or is going to be turned on, to maintain the water levels so that the private residences that are north of the project have the same level of flood protection today as they had 10 years ago. So I think you let the biology define what those hydroperiod targets are. Look for the opportunities where you can store water, and store the water where it has the least negative impacts, is generally the way I go about these
Nicole,
things.
On Pine Lake Preserve, Conservation 2020's biologist, Kathy Olson,
Yeah.
she's been wanting more water on Pine Lake Preserve for a long time, and it's in the plan, but hasn't happened yet. But I know in that particular area, which we're all familiar with right here in Bonita, they would like to have more water on that 200 acres right there.
So that's one area that's within the city limits.
Yeah,
'Cause
it
some
is.
of these other areas we're talking about are not within city limits. And so that's the next thing that I'd like for people to talk about is, within this study area, within the city limit, are we talking about this as being the ideal area for this? Are we talking about that we could make improvements and road improvements, et cetera, within the DRGR, with the possibility of improving the way it is presently going to be developed, or possible increases in development if we funded outside the city limit. I mean, is that what we're,
Well, and I think if we look at the city's stormwater master plan update, the level of service out in the DRGR is A and B. I mean, there are a couple areas that are worse, but, I mean, from a construction standpoint,
yeah,
of
we don't.
infrastructure, it
we
didn't
don't
look
flood,
all
yeah.
that bad.
The other thing I would point out is that we have, between the Pine Lake and the Hidden Cypress Preserve, which is the area north of the Youth Ranch, we have a total of 600 acres in the city limits that are in that natural category that could be probably rehydrated or and cleaned up exotics and things like that that you'd normally do in natural areas.
Of course, and you all, I know you know that Conservation 2020, which has bought a lot of property out in Crew and works with Crew, and that program, having been on that committee for many years, that's 100%
Willing seller.
willing
yes,
sellers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Willing seller program.
Yeah, and I'm certain that the Water Management District would be interested in cooperating with you in some manner, shape, or form, so that, you know, whatever is done within the city limits, obviously you would want to make sure that that work is not going to have negative impacts outside of the city, and so I would think that you would want to work on it as a collaborative effort, and, you know, where it makes sense, where it doesn't have, you know, undue negative impacts, you proceed forward with something. The reason why I was looking at that mining area that's shown up on the map up there is that it's currently disturbed land. That's the easiest place to store water, is on disturbed land. When you're just storing water on natural land, like I said, you have to be very careful to make sure that you don't negatively impact that habitat. You have a little bit more flexibility. You can store water longer and deeper on a piece of disturbed land than you can on natural land. And so that's the reason, because typically what I found in too many of the projects that I've worked on, you get into this time of the year, and if it's a wet, dry year, you know, where it just doesn't rain for months on end, you're desperately wanting water for a variety of reasons, for public water supply, for minimum flows and levels, for environmental releases, whatever. If you've got that tank that you can manage as a tank, you have more options than if you've got natural land where you've let that water go because it's time to get the water off, because it's a natural area that's expected and normally is supposed to dry up during the dry season. So then that water's not there. So that's the benefit of having a reservoir that is not in natural land.
Excuse me, didn't you say that the leakage, the water wouldn't even be there during the dry season? I mean, by the time you put water in a mine, even if you put berms around it 20 feet high, the rock layer and everything, it's gonna, the seepage goes south, and it ain't gonna be there in the dry season, I don't think.
And I think the evaporation record rate too is.
No. I think you're gonna just get, most of these basins that I've got are built above grade. They've got rim ditches around them, and they're pumped in there, and you get dikes, and you get poor water quality, and it's, to me, it's just not as good a solution. The wet season stuff, and I'd be glad to hear when Kevin comes back and talks, you're only talking about, can you store water in the natural areas, more water for a short period of time, and maybe they need that water anyway, but it's not like you're storing it all year long.
No, you wouldn't. You're correct.
But the other thing is the back to the pumping. The analysis that you did in this 09 update, it's alternate 4, it made a statement that that alternative didn't include any other improvements of flowway connections or halfway creek, or it was just standalone, let's put a basin in and pump it from Quinn Street, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
So it was no other flowway improvements or snagging or nothing? Okay.
That's correct, yeah. Yep.
And Roger, I have a couple of questions on the 10,000 acre feet issue. If I did my math correctly, it's about 3.2 billion gallons of water. Does that sound about right? It's a lot. Whatever it is, it's a lot of water.
Yeah, heck a lot of
Heck
water.
a lot, right. And I think the study even indicated that further evaluation of that option would be necessary because of the permeability limits of storing water, especially in the mine. I think the study indicated a 3.2 inches of rainfall in a particular event, and field studies showed the same depth of water at the mine than everywhere else, and it's bermed and ditched already. So there's clearly some sheet flow issues already. So I mean, you're not indicating we line it, I imagine.
Well,
Or I guess that would be an option if we go down that route.
First of all, you're correct. We're not ready to go to design. We're not ready to like issue a set of construction documents at this
Well,
point in
the
time.
reason
There's a lot more evaluation. we
Right,
have
and the
to
reason I say that is because there's a lot of people in the community that think we're evaluating this as an option, and
No.
it's far down the road.
It's
if at all,
it's
if
far
at
down
all.
the road, and I think that Dennis's idea of storing the water in the wetlands is you would certainly want to look at that very, very carefully and weigh those two options, because you know, with the implementation that's been made of Southern Crew, if there's a way to make that happen with relatively minor secondary impacts, it might be a way cheaper option to go. But that being said, I still wouldn't throw out the idea of a reservoir, because it, like I said, it gives you some options, and it's not even like, let's say for some reason you guys decide to go ahead and recommend that this project be implemented and be approved by City Council. I wouldn't say, all right, well, you definitely need to incorporate a 1,000-acre, 10-foot deep reservoir, otherwise you're going to go to hell. You know, I never would say that, but I would say if you are going to do you have to do stormwater management on that property. Concentrate it so that at some point in the future, should you decide you want to do something of a larger scale, you can. In the case of the Berry Groves Reservoir, they are proposing to line the perimeter.
Mhm.
They're going to cut a 3-foot deep trench, and they're going to put bentonite down to meet with the natural clay that's at the bottom. And there's a confining unit out in that area there. I mean, one of the consultants that's testified or presented information to you guys has said there is no connection between the superficial aquifer and the lower Tamiami because there's an intermediate confining layer. Well, that's an opportunity, okay? So you could actually store water there. It makes it expensive, I will agree. But at that point, then you essentially have a tank.
And have you evaluated, or I guess have you been involved with the ASR, the aquifer storage and recharge
recovery?
wells?
Yes, I have.
And what is your analysis of those? I mean, on the surface, not a detailed analysis. but-
Some of them work, some of them don't. Arsenic has become an issue in some of them where when they pull the water out of the ground, there's arsenic in it. That's mobilized because you're taking oxygenated water and putting it into these deep aquifers that are devoid of oxygen. And then once you introduce that oxygen, the arsenic gets dissolved out of the rocks or whatever. And so, you know, I couldn't say anything specific about how well it would work in this area here. I do know that ASR is being used down in Naples. It's been considered elsewhere. They tested it up at Berry Groves. But there's other people that are way more competent to talk about ASR than I.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, when BSU does come back and speak with their consultants, they did test that, and they did quite an extensive study and probably spent a lot of money, because it was originally part of their plan, right, Fred, to do ASR here in Bonita, and it just, the aquifers didn't work well for it.
Okay,
So-
interesting.
Yeah, it's highly site-specific in terms of where it works and where it doesn't work. And,
Right.
you know, I wouldn't want to offer an opinion about this area here. I would trust your own staff, you know, with BSU.
Couple more
Go ahead, Fred.
questions. You've done a lot of actually design works, not only on flood mitigation, but also, I think in city council, you talked about a development that you're in where you were doing the stormwater management, and you're going to reduce contamination or pollutants and all that. The question I have is, when we build here, the first thing they do is they haul in 2 or 3 feet of fill to raise the elevation of the site. And I would think, since that's the bottom of the bowl, that they would certainly do that or more. So when you take and raise the land of that development up like that, even though you're putting water storage ponds all over the place on the development, you are in effect displacing the amount of water that spot used to hold, not only by the hard surfaces and all that, but you're raising the elevation of the ground. Like, for example, if somebody was to build a nice development near Torrey's place and they raised the ground up, you could conceivably be high and dry on that, whether you raised the ground, but you could actually cause some difficulties for surrounding property. And the more you raise that ground up out there, the more you have to displace, that water's going to be displaced.
Yeah, if you take a look at all of the developments that are east of 75 and south of Bonita Beach Road, every one of those is about half lake, right? About half of the total area is some kind of lake. And because they've raised the land up, they've got to provide compensatory floodplain storage. And that's just part of the design process. And, you know, you talk to any engineer that works in the area of land development, you know, they've got these rules of thumb that I don't know because it's just not my business. But they, you know, they design that into their projects. And I'm assuming that whatever development would occur in your study area, that they would have to incorporate some sort of stormwater management as part of that development.
The developments I've been involved in, basically you balance the fill, just like you probably did at Worthington. You dig the lakes to provide the home pads, and you balance it and try to minimize because it costs money to bring dirt in.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
exactly. Last question. I know when you did the '09 study that I know in the final presentation you made a point that the GIS data that you were using, that the county had come up with a new set of much more accurate data. And that you were, I think at that time, you were recommending that the modeling, a lot of it be repeated with the newer, more accurate data. Would there be a benefit to do any modeling like that in the greater DRGR, and I would suspicion a little north of there, to see if this better data helps us or hurts us?
Yeah, the DRGR, when it was conducted, there was some newer topographic information that was being generated, and it was incorporated into a portion of the study area, and then other portions of the study area relied upon older data that was less accurate. And particularly when you get west of 75, that database of land elevation information was particularly inaccurate, and so yes, more accurate information would be appropriate, and it's available. And it would, if you're going to take the South Lee County Watershed Plan Update model and utilize it today, the first thing you'd have to do is update that topography.
Are you familiar with what Kevin Irwin's going to be doing for us?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yeah, Kevin and I have worked together on projects before, and I've having reviewed his scope, I feel relatively comfortable that, like I mentioned, you know, that if you were going to look at, say, trying to store more water in the DRGR area that is natural land, that you would want to utilize his information as a guide for where can you store the water, where are the opportunities. You know, the hydrologic restoration work has to be done like this with ecological.
I have another question, and it's, I'm sure, my misunderstanding of the way that this works, but I find an inconsistency, and that is the seepage problem
Yes,
is what helps to clean the water
correct.
and to filter it. So if we block the seepage, and according to the BSU representative, the superficial water is not as good to make into drinking water because of contaminants, et cetera. So I understand that it would be useful for rehydrating, wetland, et cetera. But the Bonita Marl and the inability for it to go down and recharge the aquifer and then lining it so it can't come through doesn't make sense with what you were saying as far as storing it for reuse, either for anything other than rehydration of the wetland and also the filtration. So can you clarify that for me?
Well, there are different ways to store water. An idea was proposed by Dennis that we should be using natural lands to store the water, and if we did that, you have the wetlands and the sand that naturally filters the water. And not only do you store some of the water, but you clean it up as well.
Right.
Okay, so that's a good thing. The negative side, which I mentioned before, was that if you want water late in the wet season, it's gone because it's soaked in the ground and it's moved through groundwater flow into whatever the nearest stream is. If you want to extend the availability, then you have to do things like putting in berms and building pump stations. And there are plenty of people in my business that are completely opposed to pumped stored reservoirs because of some of the problems that you mentioned. Okay? I recognize those problems. There's nothing perfect about a reservoir. But the reservoir does give you better ability to store the water and to be able to utilize it later on when you need to utilize it.
Then we clean it in as a separate.
Then you would at that point release the water into some sort of wetland filtering system, and then move on, and then that water would then be used for whatever beneficial purpose that is intended for it. East of Lake Okeechobee, there's something called the C44 watershed. West of Lake Okeechobee is the C43 watershed. There's a reservoir that's under construction now east of Lake Okeechobee in the C44 watershed. Half the area is a reservoir, half the area is a wetland filtering system for the water that comes out of the reservoir. The Berry Groves Reservoir project will have to address that water quality issue before it goes to construction.
And that is quite involved because of the sugarcane industry in that area and the level of contaminants in that industry, which
yeah,
are
there are more
inherent to
challenges
that.
up there than there are down here.
Right.
Relatively speaking, I would expect the water that we would be storing in that property there to be pretty clean water. I wouldn't expect it to be, of course there would be some water that would be coming off the residential development, but you could have that water pass through some sort of filtering marsh first, and then you pick it up and move it into your storage reservoir. So you cleaned it before it goes in the reservoir. There's a lot of options there that you could incorporate. And yes, it's complicated. Yes, it's more expensive, but water is not free. And my guess is 20 years from now, we'll be saying, we need more water. And we'll look back and say, you know what, we had that opportunity back in 2014. We could have incorporated that into that project. So just something to think about.
Anyone else have any questions for Roger?
I had one quick, I don't make you uncomfortable. When you did this report in October, did you just do that gratis, your firm, and just come down and do that, or would
Yes, and
you
today is
reimburse?
gratis as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So
No,
thank you.
I care about this watershed. I've been working on it since 2001 or something like that. Actually, no, 99. I started working in this area in 99. And I think that what you guys are doing is an excellent process for, trying to figure out the right thing to do. And if I can play some small part in that, I'm happy to come down to a degree on my own nickel. I've got a project I should be working on right now, and and I'm taking away from that. But yes, this is on my own nickel.
Me too.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Appreciate you coming today.
Okay.
And John, we do have Kevin here. I don't know if, probably now's the perfect time to have him. Yeah.
I'd like,
Kevin?
so Phil's back to, I was going to say, I suggest.
Oh, did Phil have a question?
Well, water management as well as, Kevin would be great too. I think both of them.
I'd like, Kevin can go first, but I just thought I'd wrap up a few things about the studies that were said, some of the questions that came up, and
Perfect.
about Southeast County.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank you for inviting Roger to come and present to you. I thought that was good information. And I don't have a whole lot to say, but one thing I do want to say, especially in light of Tori's comments and Dennis's comments, I think step back and not be so focused all the time on the Bonita DRGR, but look at where all that water is coming from, okay? And I want to meet with Lee County staff, hopefully in the next few days, to be able to see what they have been doing in the DRGR since I finished my work there a few years ago. You see, it's all linked. There's no Bonita DRGR and a Lee County DRGR. It's all one mega watershed area. And I think your opportunities for dealing with the issues that you're faced to deal with, many of them might lie outside the boundaries of the city limits. So there's ample room maybe there for participation with Lee County, in addition to the South Florida Water Management District. Just by doing that, water does not so strange things unless you're trying to look at a very small area. It's not a big surprise to me to see the things that are going on in light of what we've done to the landscape, not just on the west side of I-75, but on the east side of I-75 as well. So that's the main comment that I have for you. And you should know that I'm looking at that as well. I mean, when you look at the priority restoration areas that we identified in the Lee DRGR, those are opportunities to store water. Some of that may be land that's already owned. Some of that could be land that's identified and purchased in the future for that purpose. So.
But from a practical point of view, we are concerned with the Bonita DRGR, and what control do we have? Are we talking about funding Lee County's land? I come always back to this practicality. I love this, and I love learning all about it, and I love the connectedness of it all. But we have a very specific task over a very short period of time with very little control.
Yeah, and Kevin, I'm reminded of the adage we all learned in kindergarten: "You're not the boss of me."
Yeah.
and so I'm sure would love to, and we probably will as a task force come up with some recommendations. Hey, staff should talk to Lee County staff about maybe fixing this or doing that project or whatever it may be. So we could certainly suggest, but we only have. We don't have any control.
I'm not even
the city
saying
council.
That. I'm saying be aware of what they might be doing or what might be in their plans in the future. That
right, and I think
actually
that's why
help
we're
you out.
studying the entire area, and I would hope that that part of what you're going to do is figure out what projects have, when we're reviewing these studies, what has been completed, what's maybe on the short-term books to be completed, so that we can get a better picture. Because some of these studies are 2, 3, 4 years old.
Yeah, I would add that from what Kevin said, that I think, if I calculated it right, I think we're like 2.5% of the total 300 square mile watershed for Bonita DRGR. So it's pretty small portion.
We're at the bottom of it.
But we're at the bottom of it.
Yeah, you're at the most critical part
Right.
of it in a sense.
So I
and the
say we
most
just berm the whole northern boundary.
And dealing with the bottom end of
I'm
the
joking,
watershed
I'm
is a lot
joking.
more difficult than dealing with the mid or the upper portions of the
Right.
watershed. So
I was going to ask a question of you and actually Roger while he's still here. There is a diametrically opposite views by consultants on whether or not the clay layer or whatever that underlays our DRGR is so impervious that it really prohibits water from getting down into the aquifers. You have Mesmer, that says does not significantly contribute to the recharge of the aquifers and in particular the well fields. Now, even though Baracco says that Rawl said there is no significant recharge, if you read the Rawl report, he says there is. So who would you suggest that we would get with to get that sorted out?
a hydrogeologist. And one of the things that I'm looking for as we go through those reports that have been made available to us is to actually look for empirical data. You know, it's when we find empirical data, we might be able to answer that question. But if we're using typical graphics that you see in many reports, that you're going to end up right where you are, is asking questions like who do we believe? So we're going to be looking to see if there's any empirical data in that regard. Just like one of the main questions that came out of the, not a question, but an identified issue of the study that Roger was involved in, was the fact that there was no empirical data, shallow well data, on any of these wetlands within their study area or the areas further to the east. So it's really hard to do that kind of water budgeting if you don't have that kind of data, you see. So I know that didn't give you the answer you were looking for, but that's what we're going to be looking for first.
Hopefully in 2 months you will. Right.
Yes, I mean it's either there in that work or it's not. And and going back to the lady that made the statement during the opening remarks here today, we are looking at the information that you've made available on your website. There are other studies and information that's available that's not on the website, and I'm more than willing to look at anything that anybody provides to John and John passes along to us to have a look at. And
do you happen to know of particular studies that might be pertinent that we should look at? Or, I mean, I think we've got to capture, we can study this thing to death, but at some point, I mean, if there's something absolutely on point and crucial, I think we should know about it.
Yeah, I mean, we're looking for data, and the data is pretty, you can go through a thick report pretty quickly and find out if there's any empirical data in there that's useful. There's some work that was done by Rick Barber's firm a number of years ago that I don't think is on your list.
But I have that highlighted.
Yeah, so that's just one that stands out that actually did have some empirical data in it. It's hard to get that because people don't like to pay for data, So.
Was that the 95 study?
I believe
right,
so.
Yeah,
Yes,
I've
sir.
got that circled as well.
Yes,
I thought that might be important.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right.
Phil?
All right. Well, thank you for giving me an opportunity to say a few things. I just wanted to explain a little bit about the South Lee County Watershed Study and the update. The watershed study, the original study, was done in direct response to the major storms we had in the 90s, and they were specifically looking at increasing the conveyances and looking at flood control, and they looked at a number of different options, and they came up with the plan that was proposed, and it had two dozen specific projects and lots of other general recommendations in there. Most of those projects have been implemented. They were things like buy lands for storage, and hence the crew came about from that. There were some very specific: remove this bridge, increase the conveyance at these different locations. And the district and Lee County went forth and constructed several of those, not all, but a lot of those, and moved forward on land acquisitions for a crew, and then the Southern Crew was another specific project that came up about as well. Another thing that the mechanism for implementing those projects or implementing the plan was whenever a new development in the area came through for a permit through the district, they would be required to be in compliance with the plan. So when a development such as the Brooks or a subdivision or commercial development came on board, came in for a permit, they would have to meet the terms and conditions of the study. And so a lot of the improvements were implemented through a lot of the developments that came forth. When I-75 came through, the DOT came forward to widen I-75. A requirement of the permit was they're going to have to increase conveyance under I-75 there at the Brooks, and that was something specific that we told them that had to be in there. They came up with the idea of putting 5 culverts under I-75, put it in, and then as a result of that permit application and our draft permit that told them that yes, you must include that conveyance, those 5 culverts. There was some outroar from some of the community, Lee County as well, started questioning the validity of the South Lee County Watershed Study, although it had been adopted by both entities, the district and Lee County. As a result of the potential challenge of our permit, Lee County and the district got together and we hired AECOM to do a study to validate and review the model and all the improvements that have been made within the watershed as a result of the South Lee County Watershed Study. And that is the update, the South Lee County Watershed Study update. It was very specific in there. We had a time frame, a certain time period to do the study. We put together some specific things to do, but the purpose of it was to validate the findings in the study. It was not to redo the entire study, and it also was very specific to the western portion of the watershed. It specifically called out looking at conveyances to the south branch of the Estero, to Spring Creek, Imperial River, and Halfway Creek. I believe those were the only ones. And so we embarked upon a study. Roger Kopp was brought in to do the modeling effort of it on it. There was some environmental firm that was brought in as well that took a look at some of the environmental portions of it. The study was conducted. We went through a big public process, vetting it through the public, and lots of questions were brought up. The Lee County's DRGR study at that time was then wrapping up, and pretty soon it's, well, we should update the model again, bringing in some additional information. Let's look at this. We should expand it to this. We should expand to that. The decision by Lee County and the district was to wrap up the work, adopt the recommendations. So the entire South Lee County watershed study update was not adopted by the district. It was not adopted by Lee County. Just simply the 11 recommendations that came out of there. And to Mr. Gallagher's question, that loaded question there are numerous of I think there's 11 recommendations in there. 5 of the top 6 recommendations have been completed or are funded. But there are probably approximately half of those have been completed. Some of them include things like putting a culvert under I-75. Now, the likelihood of that happening in the next couple of months or the next year is, the DOT is going to come and, well, we'll do the same thing that we did on the South Lee County watershed study. We did not force DOT to go through and put culverts under at Halfway Creek. We waited until they came through to make their improvements, and when they did, we made that recommendation, and subsequently it has been pulled out of their permit requirement. So, kind of in a thumbnail, that's kind of how we got to where we are. The South Lee County watershed study update was not intended to go back and find additional projects. We didn't specifically go out and say, hey, let's take a look at a reservoir and look at a bunch of different scenarios and come up with the right storage project right here or there. That was one of the alternatives, one of several alternatives that were looked at. It was one that they were done at the result of public involvement and public involvement, taking a look at that. So I don't know if that helps.
Phil, I don't know if I answered it correctly when Mr. Kopp mentioned about the money that was maybe sitting there that could be spent for that I-75 crossing. Was I correct in saying that money either has been all or partially spent for the Three Oaks?
Yes. Well, the study came back saying that there was sufficient conveyance under I-75 at Halfway Creek, provided that it be maintained, and that's kind of the caveat there. But we went back to DOT and said, the intent of the culverts, the additional conveyance, was to improve the watershed. And so we told them, go find projects within the adopted, the update, the recommendations in here, go through there and come up with a project or projects to do. They identified how much money it was going to cost them to put those 5 culverts in, and they earmarked that money, and they've been working with Lee County to implement the project out there on Williams Road. It's number 4 or 5 on the list over here. But my understanding is that all those monies are going to go to that project. I'm assuming if they don't spend all that, then they would then move forward and do another project. But yes, essentially the pot of money that was earmarked has been identified for use. So.
Phil, you mentioned something about making sure that whatever's in the permit gets done. In the Bonita Stormwater Master Plan update, they mentioned Vanderbilt Lake subdivision was supposed to drain through to Audubon, and that conveyance was never constructed. Whose job is it to inspect and make sure whatever's in a permit is done?
If it's in a permit and gets done, that's something that can certainly come to us, and we can take a look at it. We would go back and take a look at the actual permit and see if they are in compliance with that permit. Was it constructed? Was it not? When projects are completed, they come forth with a certification from their engineering firm that states the work's been done. Our staff goes out and inspects it, makes sure that it has. I mean, we're not out there re-engineering the project. We take the professional engineer who signed and sealed that at their word, but we would have gone out there and made sure that it was out there. If it's not, that's something we can certainly look at, and I'll follow back up.
John, maybe you can talk about that. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I found that I don't want to say troubling, but just surprising that you would put something in a permit and then not construct it.
Well, what normally happens is you have a lot of overlap between different permitting agencies. A lot of the conditions that go on to our development orders are simultaneous to those that go on a project's ERP permit. There are certain conditions that maybe is on our permit or maybe is on a district permit that you wouldn't see on others. And for those conditions or requirements that are on multiple permits, we try to work with those agencies. So if we are out doing our inspection and we notice there is an issue, we will let them know that there's a problem or something hasn't been done. There are a few instances where you see a condition or a very specific requirement for that property only on one permit that we may or may not know about.
Right.
But it has been something that we've looked to provide more coordination, not only between us and the developer, but also with the other permitting agencies so that everybody's on the same page.
Okay, yeah, perfect.
Quick question for Phil. I had heard that there was also either a chance or there was water capable of going south to the Corkscrew Canal, which is down there east of Twin Eagles at the Mockley Road turn near Golden Gate. Is that something that's in place or being studied or as another release valve?
I'd have to go back and take a look at that one specifically.
Okay.
There were recommendations to move, additional water to the south through the original Southie County watershed study. It wasn't part of the update, but I'd have to go back and take a look at that for you.
When you're looking at that, I was told by somebody reliable, the only thing is they're so reliable I've forgotten who in the heck it was, that another part of the state to do with wildlife and all that objected to allowing as much water to go that way as was originally hoped to go.
That happens sometimes.
Yeah.
And particularly studies when they become a few years old, rules change, and endangered species, are now, they weren't endangered back then. Things change, and we may have something specific in a plan. If there's a better way of implementing it,
Right.
we would be amenable to do something different as well. So, but
We have the representative from Crew, I believe, is here. I'd just like to ask her the question of what Dennis was saying and about putting more water in. Like, what's Crew's feeling about this idea of using that land since she's here?
Sure.
Versus the mine or something?
Brenda Brooks, Crew Land and Water Trust. So the question is,
Well, if we are talking about more storage.
Do you want more
storing
water?
Do you want more water?
I think more water would be wonderful.
On the Crew
yes,
land.
but keep in mind that it is the South Florida Water Management District that does own that land. But our feeling is that more water on that land would be great. And that's really what the restoration project is about that they've been working on, that will hold water on the land longer. Is that it?
And I think recently you posted something on your website about, hey, we've got, 7 inches of water now. Look at the roads are all flooded. It's fantastic.
We love it. It's a watershed.
so-
Watershed. It's perfect.
All right, I think we're done. No.
Okay.
Thank you, Brenda.
Right.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, now I know Nicole needs to leave relatively soon, so I think we should, to the extent we can, bang out these studies. And I know Nicole circulated some pretty good comments, so maybe you want to go first.
Oh, okay, sure.
Or we'll go, I guess we'll go one study at a time, but I'll let you. So you
Well,
get to pick
and-
which study you want to talk about first.
And if I can just preface this
Oh,
for
sure.
the folks and whoever might be listening. So in the packet, there were comments that Dave had provided about the particular studies. Nicole was able to meet our Friday deadline and get me her comments, so I emailed those out to you. I have hard copies of those in case anybody didn't have a chance to print that out. So I can pass those out
Thanks, John.
if anybody needs, because those went out, I think, late
I have-
Friday.
yeah.
And then I understand that Dennis may have some to hand out
I made
also.
copies for that.
Okay, maybe start with the South Lee County Watershed Plan update, if that's good for everyone. And, my comments were, first of all, this was done for a couple of very specific purposes as part of the permit for the I-75 widening. But that the plan did have a number of projects, some of them directly within the city, others that, because we're at the tail end of the watershed, could impact the city. positively if implemented. But really what I had focused in on is the question of which of those projects has been done, which is in process, and which will be done. I also thought that the idea of alternative 4, which we've been talking about quite a bit, of the additional water storage. I don't know as I like the term reservoir. Reservoir might be a solution, but additional water storage, how to have that compensatory area for holding water back where it will not provide an environmental detriment, but would be beneficial for habitat, water quality, flood protection, all of that. So I think that our discussion on that is really, getting us down the right path. And I would hope that one of the principles that could come out of today is really looking further at this idea of additional storage, whether it's reservoirs, making sure that we get water to the right place on the right parcels, starting with the parcels in public ownership, seeing if there are other parcels where it would make sense, where we could start discussions on that. And then the other thing that I found interesting on, and I apologize, it looks like I didn't label or put page numbers on my information, but looks like it would be on page 6 of the plan, that table on page 1-19, that table 1-5. And it looks to me like what this is saying is that with all of the development, with the ability for the floodplain not to go where it naturally goes, you're now having more flooding, higher peak stages with rain events that are less and less. So in the past, the Imperial River has been able to sustain quite a bit of water, flood out of its banks, and not have that peak stage stay at a higher level. But because of all the development, all the constrictions in the floodplain, the bottom line is more development, more constrictions. You're going to have a more severe flood event from a lesser amount of rainfall as we keep going forward, if that makes any sense. So that was...
May I ask a question, though? How do you draw that conclusion if we've now implemented improved planning and requirements within the city from that new development would not allow that to happen? That may have been the case in the past, but if the requirements of new development is to not allow that to happen, then that shouldn't be repeated. We should, I believe, have within the city those regulations in place, and with water management as well. And then if we're talking about even maybe tightening it up a little bit further east, then we're really talking about a situation that occurred previously but is now in new development being rectified, from my understanding.
Right, and I think what we need to do is be somewhat cautious about jumping to either a conclusion or a statement about what we're going to do as a city, develop or whatever. I think what we need to do is kind of look at all these studies and look at the facts and come to conclusions or statements as a group that we can have a consensus on going forward. I mean, I think this table is helpful to show that there's
Table 1-5, I'm not a hydrologist, perhaps a hydrologist could comment on it. That was what I understood from that, and I'm sharing that with you.
No,
I'm not
I appreciate that. No, of course. No, we're all going to have our own thoughts about it. And I think, in reading the study, I think the 95 event was, it was almost a perfect storm, almost more so than a 100-year storm because of the massive amount of rainfall coming up to that one event. And so I think that with the ground so saturated, there's almost nothing that could have fixed that. And that's what I read through, is we can plan for a 100-year storm, a 25-year or 5-year storm. We can't really plan for these perfect storms where where there's just, it's going to happen, who knows how often, but very, very infrequently. But I was, I think, surprised as you were that there's less flow in the Imperial River, yet the banks are higher. And so that's a fact. We got to figure out what
it's worth.
Right. So.
Point.
Fred?
Well, I think that's why I asked the question of Roger. I think we really need to get officially, I don't care whether it's from the U.S. Weather Bureau or what these different storm events were that did, because there's people that say it was a 100-year storm, and there's people that are saying it's a whole lot less. And I think it's,
Well, but again, we can take a snapshot of anything. I mean, Roger had a map up of how much water was on the land on a particular day.
right.
That might be helpful for that particular day, but in evaluating over a course of time, we're going to have to review.
Oh,
To
yeah,
your
but
point,
where I'm coming from is that, let's assume for sake of discussion, that the storms that caused the flood of 95, the 05, and the 08 was not a 100-year storm, was not a 50-year storm, was somewhere more like a 10-year event, but we had this situation, we had this summer where we had this ground was pretty well super saturated, which is more normal. If that happens to be right, then if we ever got that 25 or 50-year storm in here, there would be some really serious flooding.
Well, I think that's what the difference is if we get that extra heavy rain when we've already had 4 previous storms, it matters whether it shows up in June or it shows up in September, because the amount of water that's already on the land when that extra bunch comes in, it's kind of like having a storm by the ocean when there's a high tide. It has a
Right.
different effect. It might be the same size storm, might even be less of a storm, but if it hits during high tide, it has a heck of a lot more damage.
I'm afraid that we'd be, well, again, I respect your question, but I think we might be chasing our tail. I mean, you could have a couple things happen. You got a 300 square mile watershed. You could have a 10-year storm on this end of it and a 50 on the other, or you could have 2 10-year storms back to back and have the same
Yeah.
damage as a 50-year storm. I mean, so
Yeah.
there's so many variables in there. I think we have to really rely on the experts that do the modeling, and all the modeling, as we know, is based on assumptions. Some of them we might look back 10 years later and say that wasn't a good assumption, but
Yeah.
it's only as good as
Well,
our
that-
experts can say.
That's
so-
why I've asked Mr. Kopp to get back to us with what those storms really were that we had. And I think it's reasonable to assume that normally if we're going to get a hurricane or a severe tropical storm in here, we tend to get it towards the latter part of the hurricane season. So there's a good chance that when we get a good storm, that the ground will be anywhere from fully saturated to, say, 70% saturated, because normally we tend to have wet summers. We had 3 or 4 years in a row where we didn't. Last year, we kind of made up for what we didn't have, I believe.
You know,
It-
one thing that's really interesting here in this context right now is we looked at Roger's table with, I think it started in 2006. with
Right.
all that, every year, year and a half, it was, there was a lot of water in that table. But that didn't even include the really high ones we've had lately. We had 92 was extremely high. 95 was even a little bit higher. And then the next really high one we had was 08, but there were a number of them in there between all those. And you're right about the time of year. The high water day of the year in this area, and right in our area here, the high water day of the year averaged back over 50 years is October the 5th.
Huh.
So it's that late because it takes that long for the sheet flow to come down through the center of the state.
Right.
And when we look at this big picture here, we've had an awful lot of 50-year storms in the last 15 years,
And Fred, at the last
High
meeting,
water coming.
last meeting, Tori mentioned wonder maps, which I went to and had a lot of fun with. So I'd encourage you to check those out, because you can go back historical data with tides or with
What was the reference?
wonder
again?
maps.
Wonder map.
Online.
With a
It's through
U.
Weather Underground, so.
With a
but-
U, W-U. Can I ask a question about this map we keep holding up with the blue and where you redrew the line, Dennis? I kind of don't understand why the blue just stops where it stops and it looks as if it never rains west of the pit. I don't know. I mean, it sounds strange, but it gives a false look to see all that water. It looks like there's all that water that's blue on the right, and then as it goes past the
I think
pit and
that's,
toward-
but I
and
think that's standing water on a particular day.
Okay.
That's depth of
'cause
water on a
I know
particular day.
Fred asked about it. He was like, well, doesn't it flood all the way up to the interstate? I mean, the water does go all the way to the interstate. It is a deceiving look, isn't it?
It's
And,
just, apparently it's just not as deep.
I think that he said it was a 10-year storm or
I don't know if that's true,
something.
because a lot of my friends who have stables along the interstate, their horses are up to their elbows in a bad storm. So it's not actually, for some reason, they only put it that far, but I don't think it's just the depth, because you can ask some of these people that live along the interstate there, and they're gonna say it gets deep too.
Like Kevin said, we need empirical data, and that
Right.
we will maybe get.
It's a deceiving map.
Kind of clarify some of this.
Okay, does anybody else have any comments? They want-
No,
oh, sorry,
were we
ahead,
going to go
Dennis, please.
study by study? I know Nicole had to leave. Are we going to do study by study, or just let Nicole do hers?
Yeah, why don't we go ahead, why don't you go ahead and just put your comments on the record for what we've got
Okay.
for each
And
of the studies.
I'll stay till 3:30 if that,
Oh, okay.
does that help? So
That'll be
yeah.
great.
I'm going to pass out mine, because I'm not going to even talk about it, because I've addressed everything with Mr. Kopp, I think that, so I'm going to just pass these out, and you can, but I think everything here, I've either asked it, or he's answered it, or whatever, so. And then that last reference, Fred, is the part of the 99 study that referenced the storage, so, that's it.
All right, so if that's the case, let's continue on with the South Lee watershed update. Anybody else want to share their thoughts about it? Did everybody do their homework? I'm going to check you absent.
Yeah.
Since we had most of that discussion with the COP
Right.
and Irwin and Flood, we're probably.
I know, yeah,
pretty
I know,
well
we're
saturated
we're
with that one.
yeah, this one's been pretty good.
I've pretty much asked the questions I had in regard to it verbally, and then, of course, I agreed with a lot of Nicole's and David's information that they sent out early.
Okay.
I mean, I had noticed the same things out of it. They basically, you reviewed it and made it concise. I thought it was very helpful, but
So what do we want to do then with, everyone has had a chance to read these studies, and we've talked about it.
Well, my
what do we
hope
do
is
with
to
it now?
create a consensus on each item, and I don't think if we create consensus on a study, it's helpful, but my thought was, and I can share this with the group, was to maybe pick the various rivers and canals and talk about them from a factual standpoint and put that in the parking lot. Imperial River has too much water. Spring Creek, Halfway Creek have too little water compared to historic flows.
Who had too much water?
Spring Creek and Halfway Creek.
And
Oh, sorry, too little water. And Imperial has too much.
Doesn't have too much.
Well-
Be careful with flows and levels, because we don't want to wind up with, right now, the Imperial River is 1 inch deep under I-70, so,
Well, and I should say,
be careful calling that too much.
right, too
water.
much in a storm event. There's too much flow in a storm event through Imperial, not enough through the other
Oh, okay. That's-
conveyances that were planned to
That's
get
all
rid
right.
of some
That's
of the
all right, yeah.
stormwater.
well,
Right.
I get asked by quite a few people about, it comes up, and certainly some realtors have contacted me about it, and they've said, well, what you all need to do is just dig a big ditch out there, a big canal, and, this, the idea, I think, that you're bringing up, Colin, is that when it's running, it can run too fast, and then there's not enough later in the season to make it more.
No, I'm just taking exception to the
Right.
comment,
Be-
too
Yeah.
much water.
Oh, and I meant in a
Being
in a
real
storm event, I
specific
apologize.
about-
No,
but,
but I find that people, that if we drain it too quickly, we cause red algae blooms, we cause it to dry too quickly, we don't hold enough of it, and then, if we hold too much of it, so that's the tricky part, I think, that Mr. Kopp was talking about, is trying to balance that out so that we have,
Well,
to
there are a
not
lot of-
let anything we do.
There are a lot of tricky parts. Like, for example, I'm not seeing otters anymore. I don't know why.
I haven't
I
seen
just am
otters
not
this
seeing
year.
them. I used to see otters constantly. Every day or two, I'd see them.
I've seen
Not
them
seeing them now.
I've seen them in the Imperial.
Well, I'm
But I haven't
talking
seen 'em
about, I
for the
live
last
right
two
on the Imperial
seasons.
River, and I'm not seeing them with the frequency I used to see them. So that's.
I don't know, I haven't seen them the
worrisome to
last
me.
two
Right.
seasons.
And I don't know why that is. I'm not blaming it on any particular thing, but for some reason, we're not seeing otters. That's an indicator that I'm sorry to see. So.
But, so I just think that I need to say that out on the recording here. in case people are looking, that I have heard that quite a bit. And when you're talking about the rivers, that's one thing that I think is important, is that we don't get this idea that we're just going to, dig it deeper, run it faster,
Right.
and then have all these algae blooms out in the.
Well, or the bigger problem is draining wetlands. I mean, we don't want to do that either. We need the wetlands to stay wet,
Right.
and that's why, but that's, I guess my point is to try to get to a factual, in the parking lot, get some statements on fact that we can put into our overall report at the end, and so, I mean, I think with today, we're looking at these studies. Next week, we're going to talk about water quality, next meeting, 2 weeks from now. And then hopefully, after that, the meeting after that, we can maybe start putting some statements down.
Well, if I had
Or
an
to
overall
specific
general
areas.
feeling from this is just mine from reading the studies, et cetera, I think that there's been a lot of money spent, a lot of expert people giving great recommendations. And at the end of the day, I just thought to myself, well, if we have these recommendations, such as storing more land east, why hasn't it been either adopted? Why was it not adopted in the first place? And so, and why hasn't it been done? And my guess is we either don't have the money or it's not practical. So, again, that was one of the main things that I came on into this group with, is what's feasible, and so I keep having to go back to the city to say, I mean, what is the feasibility of asking everyone to pay more in a special, East Bonita water thing that we're going to raise? Can we raise $50 million? Is there even a feasibility of this money, or are we all going to look, and as Mr. Kopp said, it's on a shelf somewhere. Everyone's waiting on it. So when we're talking about these things, that has to, I think, be really important, is to pick things that we can actually implement, that we can actually afford, or a methodology towards affording it.
Right, but that's the conclusion stage. I was hoping to get to the fact collection stage, so that we can come to a consensus on certain facts that we can put in the parking lot.
But did anyone disagree with any of the facts in the studies?
No, but I mean, I think if we just hand over the studies to the city and say, here we agree, nothing's going to happen. I think our job is to synthesize the studies to a sense, to get to a sense where we can say, our concern with the Imperial River is, too much flow in a storm, too little flow in
My concern is that they haven't implemented
the.
the things that were already suggested.
Okay, and from staff's perspective, just so you can kind of maybe put a bow around this, is that I'm hearing what both of you are saying, and I think what would be a great goal for the group to shoot for, maybe not next meeting, because next meeting is going to be more of the water quality issues, but maybe 2 meetings down the line, 2 or 3 meetings down the line. If you could, we've identified, we've gone through 3 studies. I think next homework assignment included 4. If we could get a consensus of, here's what we agree these studies say, and then maybe even here's what we think we still need to know. If part of the here's what we agree the studies say are some recommendations, and this gets to your point, which ones seem viable to the group, and then it can be a staff assignment to find out, okay, given that these are recommendations that you're considering, which of those are real, which of those are possible, and then we can shift on some of that burden.
But
and
that's
come
almost
back
to the
you.
conclusion step.
But I'm saying, if as part of the consensus, the group can come to some consensus as to some of the recommendations that are in those different reports, that would be great. If you can't, because that second piece, here's what we still need to know, is too big, then maybe there are no recommendations as to conclusions. You see what I'm saying?
Fred?
Well, I think Tori brought up a lot of good points. I think the things I take away from the '09 study is that, and it was based on, I think it was a '99 study of Lee County, but the reason those studies were done was flooding. And Bonita Springs, but elsewhere in southern Lee County. That the water flow that comes into the DRGR does come from other places than what just drops out of the sky, and what is it within the city limits of Bonita Springs. I think that what Tori has brought up is a good point. It's a lot, trying to raise $50 million or whatever it is. Oh, the other thing that the studies, both the 99 and the 10, or the 09 said was, we need large storage areas. That can be reservoirs, it can be what Dennis proposed, which is a real good idea. But that's another commonality that was in the 99, which the 09 was kind of the update of that. Now, when you get down to the money, here's, and I'm going to use an analogy, and it probably, somebody will quickly say it's not very good, but I think it's very similar. If and when we get a big storm, a really big storm, especially if we have that supersaturated ground condition, the amount of property damage and the mess that we're going to have will cause us to probably spend a lot more money than whatever it would cost to create some of these large storage areas. And if you think about it, you had the city of New Orleans for years sitting there, and they finally really got it. And if you look at how much money's been poured in there, I don't want to see us have to rely on FEMA and the federal government to bail us out after we've. But there is flooding in Bonita Springs, and that's a definite. The flood maps of both of the 2010 study that Intera did as well show that. So I don't know if we can agree on some of those things I threw out or not.
Well, I think one of the things that, to Tori's point about, okay, is a $50 million reservoir, 1,000 acres, 10 feet deep feasible? Perhaps not, but as Roger had said, you can do it more creatively. Smaller storage areas, multiple storage areas. Can you, without doing ecological damage, have more water filtered into the crew land? So I think that with the experts that Roger said he's willing to come back and talk with us again. So I think these are some of the things that we're taking a recommendation. We're saying maybe we like the concept, but we're not sure that as stated it's feasible. Can we work through it to make something that would work? So, I think that's something that we also have the latitude to do, to try to tailor some of our recommendations from what's in the study, build upon it, and come to a recommendation, perhaps.
But does that become something, because we are under a moratorium right now, does that become something where we say, okay, if we suggest or recommend that we spend the money and help divert and store more water on the water management and crew land before allowing the pit to go ahead? I mean, I'm just trying to be more practical, because we have people who want to do things out there, and this is supposed to be sort of we've got just the moratorium for a year. So I'm just hoping to keep this from just dragging on with hopefuls. How much is it going to cost to get that water onto crew land, and how long will it take so that we can say to this person, you're never going to build there, or yes, you are going to build there, and move the process.
Well, and the district and crew are here, and I think they will be at subsequent meetings, so I think that we can kind of move all of it forward together and come up with maybe a complete package for that.
Right, but I guess to my point, do we want to just move on to the recommendations, or do we want to back that up and say we're all in agreement with these facts? We've seen these recommendations. Here's what we think the city should move forward with. Here are some alternatives that we think the city should consider. What does it look like at the end of the day? Because we have to present something to the city, and we're supposed to be actually.
The only thing that I'm
providing
seeing a
updates,
difficulty is the marl, and I have a bunch of friends that dig wells, and they say it's there, and so I'd like that. Otherwise, the studies that I looked at, I thought seemed. I mean, I'm not that educated about it, but they seemed like they'd been done very professionally.
I don't think there's that much. Well, I think that there's statements that, like you're saying, Fred, is it consistent? And I'll buy inconsistent. I'm sorry. I'll say it's not consistent. Significant. I'm okay with that word.
Right.
Then the issue is, okay, so what? What do you do with that knowledge? And I think the answer to that is probably in the BSU consultants, but it's probably like you've got in other parts of Lee County, which is low impact development standards that compensate and add raise the water level, make sure that we're helping water quality while we're doing that, and I think there's ways to do that. But the other thing I would just say is just, as we get into, I would suggest that we look at it still by the categories that we have. We have surface water, which is the flooding. We have the water quality, and we have the water resources, and they're all interrelated. We know that. But the studies are pretty well specific to the consultants that are experts in those areas. So we kind of have to look at it in those three categories and then come back and say, okay, there's some interrelated stuff like low impact development is, that maybe across all three, or recommendations
I
of
agree,
something else,
and
like storage might cross
Right.
2 or 3. Yeah.
Right, and I think the low impact development is a recommendation, a conclusion, not
Yeah.
necessarily a fact.
Right.
I'm still
Right.
trying
And
to.
I'm just saying the facts are pretty much by the categories
Right.
I just mentioned,
Right.
because that's the way the studies are presented pretty much.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with what Tori was talking about, and I think our job is to indeed look at the recommendations. The ones that have been implemented are probably the low-hanging fruit that could be done with minimal political effort, low costs, availability. It's done. Now what they're looking for is us to come in with the recommendations that are hard. They're going to be more expensive, they're going to take longer, they're going to hurt. And and maybe we only have 2 recommendations come out of the task force, but they should be
Perhaps.
real substantive, meat on the bones type of work.
Right.
Because the low-hanging fruit is probably gone. But that's the question I had and she had. What's been done? Let's have a spreadsheet. Here's the listing of the projects, and they're approved, they're funded by, and dates and times.
So then a scientific question would be, do we all agree that there should be more water held somewhere east? Whether it's Crew or the mine or the Pine Lake or some of the city land already owned in public.
Pine Lake's only 180 acres, so.
But
I
what we
know
were
that
saying
should
was,
be one of
if
them,
it's
yeah.
a 180, then as Nicole was saying, there could be some that are together with a flowway or kind of in a pattern, but do we all agree on that? I would.
I don't know, and I think the
Definitely,
point
yes.
the point being the studies have indicated that there are problems with some of the existing flowways. So when you divert and get them correct, then what do we need? And perhaps it's some sort of aquifer storage, surface or underground. Whatever.
I mean, I can't answer the question either, but it's
right,
rhetorical,
and
but yeah.
I think the studies have shown, for example, what you're saying is yes. The answer is yes. Storage is good, and more storage is good. I think higher water levels in the ground versus the ditching and pumping, that's good. Those, I think we can probably come to some of those kind of statements and say, okay, where do you go with that? I don't know, but I think we can agree that, improve water quality by at least 25 to 30%, that's good, that's something we need to do, but
So then, to Mr. Irwin's point, the next step logically to me would be to say, what of that is being presently affected outside of the city limit, and what possibilities do we have within the city limit to add? If we don't have to do it for all of Lee County, but do we have any particular publicly owned land or land which is currently for sale that could possibly help fit that bill, so that we could?
Well, let me clarify my point too, because it wasn't necessarily that I object to storing water. I guess my point was artificially. I think we need to evaluate to the extent we're storing water, which I think is probably going to be one of the conclusions. Can we keep that on some of the natural lands and just increase? And in my mind, I don't see that as artificial. I see that as
But
a
that's
natural,
what I mean by
restoring the natural
Right.
wet areas.
But that's what I mean is perhaps land along Morton Avenue isn't as acceptable as putting money into the water that's already at the east end of our boundaries and pushing that back towards the Crew land. That's what I'm saying is,
Right.
is when we're looking at this, is it right to be talking about doing it on my land or Citrus Park, or when it might behoove us to see what the county's doing and then have that idea? Because I'm not for a reservoir at all. I would much rather keep it on already publicly owned land, which is, in my opinion, why water management why we went through what we went through in '95, which, as you can tell, I'm always stinging about. So, that land we already own. I'm looking at what we can do on publicly owned land.
Another thing we can do that would help, specifically what Fred was saying about the fill, bringing fill in, raising the land. The flea market is built up. The flea market on Bonita Beach Road has no fill under it. It's all built as if it were on pilings. There are some stem walls, but water flows underneath the flea market as a requirement by the Water Management District right after the '95 flood. They required that. I think we should do that in the whole DRGR. We should have no more
Well,
fill in the DRGR.
again, we're getting to
except in the
conclusions.
one really obvious case, like if you're going to do a road, maybe we even want to do an impervious road, or a pervious road, a pervious road, like Kent Road. Kent Road is all pervious. It was done in a settlement agreement when I pushed for the bridge removal and worked with the Water Management District, and they worked with the Corps of Engineers, and that road is pervious. You could dump 50 gallons of water in the middle of the road, and it disappears right through the road.
I guess I don't really see the problem with going towards conclusions if we have, this was part of the whole thing as to how many more studies do we need.
Well,
If we're
this is a
drawing
recommendation,
consensus.
no more fill in
Yeah.
the DRGR.
If we're drawing consensus on some of these studies, as we go along, we can say, well, that, we're kind of traveling in a direction. It doesn't have to be finalized yet, but I don't think we have to hold off with some of these discussions if we're getting such fabulous information. I have to say, I really
we
think
can
the
certainly put
presenters
things in
are-
the
In the parking lot, yeah.
But I think we need to be careful about saying, okay, well, no more fill in the DRGR, and you're required to build on stem walls. If we
Pilings.
or whatever, or pilings. But if we figure, if we do some more, if we study some more things or review some more studies,
Right,
that
and
say,
before I would say that, I'd have to look at septics and wells. We have to really look at that.
I think that's my point, is
They may be
before,
all right.
and stem wall construction might be the answer, but let's not draw the answer before we figure out the facts.
And I'd like to have a better understanding of, are these lands that, and it might be something that Kevin could look into, are these lands that we're going to maybe consider for additional water storage? Would it truly be restoration of those lands? Would it change the hydro period and therefore the vegetative community? I don't think we'd want to do anything that would, for example, take an upland and artificially drown it out to convert it to a wetland. I think we want to make sure that anything that we're doing in natural areas benefits that natural area and isn't just additional stacking of water, which I think we're going to have more information on before we.
Right, it's a good point that was brought up on page 3-19 of the South Lee Watershed Plan update. Was there were some areas of Melaleuca where they restored, even if they restored the natural watershed, it wasn't going to resolve the problem. So that's not restoration in my mind. That's just adding more water to
I think the other thing we're looking at, is there a need for land use changes as well? And even though that's not technically in the resolution that we've discussed that, but what we're talking about has to be funded. And if we're just saying there's improvements without any funding, nothing's ever going to happen. If we say we want all these things, but there's no way to pay for it, the city, I don't believe, is going to raise taxes to solve the issues that are currently there, or they would have already done it probably from all the studies. I think the issue is, in my view, how do you allow sufficient development or land use changes that would help pay, or maybe more than pay their way to do some of the things we want, or you kill the goose that laid the golden egg, and you never get anything. So I just think that's going to be my approach, is how do you do public-private partnering to create those kind of solutions? Because I've done that throughout the last 30 years here in Bonita, and I think that is going to be a good part of the answer in my view.
Fred?
Another solution to getting water storage on existing property, and that is the government is now starting, you know how they pay some farmers not to farm certain crops? Well, they're now starting to pay farmers and other landowners money to allow water to stand on the property. So that is a source to take care of some of this. And the one thing it would seem to me, since both the 99 and the 2009 studies that were funded by South Florida Water Management and Lee County, said we need to increase water storage, and it needs to be large storage. I think for us on this panel to say that we don't disagree with that. is
Right,
kind
but
of-
they purchased 4,000, where's the water management, sorry. Mr. Flood, how much land was purchased for the crew in the 95 buyout and the eminent domaining, that whole area out there that was purchased, I believe, for this specific reason, which is not within the city?
That's the area that we call Southern Crew or Critical Crew.
Right.
It's right there. It's north of Bonita Beach Road and east of Bonita Grand. Is that, I get those right?
Right, and isn't it
It's
4,000?
right at 4,000 acres.
Yeah, but,
yes.
Right.
but what I'm saying is, okay, 95 was the eminent domain. The first study was 99, which would be after 95, and the next study was 09, and both studies say we need to increase the amount of large storage. Now, whether that's reservoirs or spreading it out all over.
But we also know that the work was not done. It was never completed. The
Right.
land was purchased, but the work was not done. And so that study saying that there needed to be more was
Right.
working off a study that the work hadn't been done. The land had been purchased, but the work had not been done.
That is a
So-
shovel-ready project right there. And literally it was just about 2 months ago that we got authorization to do a land swap to get the one last piece of property that's needed in order to do that project.
So I'm saying that we may not need to purchase more land within the city of Bonita for that specific purpose because their work hasn't, no offense,
No,
but
I-
their work hasn't been completed.
I
Because they're
didn't
about to complete their work, or start their work at
If
least.
if you listen carefully to what I said create additional large water storage. That's what both studies said.
Right.
Didn't say buy land and all that. It just said we need to create more large areas of water
And
storage.
that was the purpose of the acquisition of
But we
Southern
haven't
Critical
created, so
Crew.
wouldn't that be something we can agree on since two studies, 99 and 09, both said the same
And so
thing?
we should recommend that,
That be created. I didn't say
that you guys
buy.
do your, do your
I think
work. I mean, I just-
No, the word's large.
Again, we're talking about parts out of city too, when you're talking about crew. In fact, all of it.
Right, that's what I'm saying, is that impacts, I don't want to make a decision in the city to take farmland that's not as suitable to become storage land because the crew land isn't storing it yet when it's about to. That's what it was bought for.
When they haven't said, how much water are we going to store on crew? Because I've heard two different versions.
How
of
many
it.
acre feet? Yeah. How many acre feet?
Yeah, how many acre
4,000.
feet are we adding?
Well, there's Crew and then there's Southern Crew. Crew is the land,
Well,
is
I
the
don't care
Corkscrew
which one
Swamp
it
area. Southern Crew is a specific project right there along the Kiel Canal, just north side of the Kiel Canal.
Right.
It's a 4,000 acre parcel. I honestly, I don't know how much acre feet of storage they're looking at. It's more of a rehydration project, but there will be a number associated with it, you know, whether it's
Right.
4,000 or 8,000 or whatever it might happen to be, but
And-
the idea is to hold that water on the landscape. Take the drains out of there that exist today, the roads out of that are diverting that water in different directions. So.
And Phil, Roger made the comment, I'm paraphrasing here, but we might be draining too much water to the east, and so to
Right.
fill those ditches and canals and stop that drainage.
That's exactly the purpose of that.
Yeah,
Right, so-
all I was saying, trying to get to a consensus, but we can put it in the parking lot, is we just say,
And-
we agree with both studies that say we need to create additional large storage areas.
Right, and Fred, I think we talked about that earlier where I said, I'm not in a position to jump on board with that, and I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
I'd rather see us focus on restoring wetlands to a position where if it's an extra inch of water, and that's beneficial to that wetland, but we don't have those answers.
Right.
So to say we need additional storage, we need something, whether it's additional storage or something else. But I think we can put in the parking lot that idea. But
And then-
I think that's a conclusion we're not ready to make without all the facts.
Yeah, I just remind you, those were two studies that were adopted by South Florida Water Management as well as Lee County.
Well, it was an alternative, it wasn't a recommendation.
Well,
No,
It was-
some of, they were recommendations. they weren't, some of it wasn't adopted, but it was recommendations, so they were still, it's still the people that did those things are experts.
But I believe Mr. Kopp said it was not as feasible at that time because we didn't have the purchase, land had not been purchased. It has been purchased now. At the time, I'm sorry, would you mind coming back up to the microphone for a minute? I believe when Dennis first brought up about possibly using some of the crew land to store more water, to retain more water, that you said that at the time, that was not as feasible because we did not have as much land in public holding, and that now we do have more land, that it's more feasible now, and if it was looked at again, that it may be, am I paraphrasing what you said,
You
Chris?
got it exactly right.
There you go. Thank you.
I like what John had said was, a couple meetings from now, maybe we need to organize first into the statements or issues we agree on, and then get into recommendations or parking lot ones or both, whatever.
Perfect.
And it may not be unanimous, but at least we've got them listed, and if they're not unanimous, that's okay too, probably.
I agree. I agree. And that was, right, perfect. Okay. Do we want to move on to the next study? Anybody else have any comments on the watershed plan update?
Well, I think that we need to at least acknowledge that flooding is a problem in Bonita Springs. Because
that's
you
why
got
we're-
two studies that were done because of flooding. So it would seem to me that that's, now, how bad is flooding and where is all the spots that are bad, that's a different issue.
Well, the actual Southern Crew, the way that they actually got land from FEMA was actually because of the flooding, but it was a three-legged stool. It was to improve habitat, I think Cullum can help me with this, it was for habitat, for flood, and for water quality. So it was not just the flooding. That is what actually allowed them to use the FEMA funds, but it was a habitat issue as well. So that's where I come along on, maybe Nicole too, in the sense that if we then build a reservoir that doesn't do for the habitat, we've certainly addressed the flooding, but we haven't balanced it with the habitat. So I agree there's flooding, but I agree that there's more to this whole DRGR than just the flooding. And I think that it has been somewhat co-opted a little bit by some of the developments on the south side of Bonita Beach Road in East Bonita to being a flood issue, but it is a larger issue than that. It's a habitat issue as well.
Right.
And
Agree with
water
that.
quality.
Mr. Chairman, if Nicole's going to be leaving, and then we've got these other two studies, we probably aren't going to get through them all. And should we put those for next time? I know we're going to have the other presentations, but just like these, I mean, that we can still discuss these at the next meeting, maybe.
Yeah, why don't we take a high-level look at these two, and then we can go into detail next meeting? Does that work? Okay.
That's a good idea.
So let's go to the Mike Shee study, the DHI.
Nice maps. That's
Yeah.
my high-level assessment.
Yeah.
It was a really fairly technical report, and most of it really dealt with the Lee DRGR and excluded the Bonita DRGR, but some of the maps did have the entirety of the watershed, so I felt that, for what it's worth, some of the maps were educational. That was all I could pull
agree,
out
and
there.
don't you think it was primarily involved in the mining question?
Yes, and it's really important that we understand this was a study that didn't change any of the underlying stormwater facilities. What it did is just say, if we develop as current conditions exist, what would happen to
With
the
more mines or less mines,
Right,
yeah.
right. So, I mean, I think the purpose of the study doesn't help us very much, but the maps sure are nice.
Yeah.
I've got comments I'll just pass out. I don't really need to go through them all, but review them in your leisure. I've already given them to John for the record. And, but one thing I saw in there that kind of got my attention was that the, is there more? You had two, you had three in there. Was that the assumption was that there would be major restoration areas that wasn't currently available for funding. So, so I think like in our case, I mean, we have, it gets back into me to this financially feasible. So the assumptions need to be financially feasible or doable, if you will, whichever way we go on some of these. But I agree with what you said, that it was really specifically for mining analysis and permitting, and there are some good maps and data available. And I pointed out in my comments that that Bonita's DRGR is 6% of the size of the Lee County DRGR, so that the grid that they use for their modeling probably wouldn't be as finitely usable for us here if we wanted to go with that kind of modeling. So.
And I'll just,
And I think we can put that one to bed. I don't think we need to talk about that one next week because it wasn't,
yeah.
so,
Can I make one comment about that?
please?
Understand that the work that we did, we took their model and we added a lot of detail in the area from Corkscrew Road south. So really you have something that's basically stood on the shoulders of the work that they did.
Right, you could have taken 50 pages out of your study by saying, we did what they did and made it better.
Right, yeah.
All right, city stormwater master plan update.
And I'll jump in. This was another tough one for me to slog through. Lots of technical things in there, but what I got out of it, and I don't know if this is correct or not, but the stormwater master plan was looking at certain identified areas of problem. But as part of that process, they have documented all of the canals and the structures and essentially where water goes everywhere in the city. And so my thought was, if we get to a point where we're looking at potentially some different scenarios, would we be able to have them run that to say, if this is done here, how will the water then flow out? And so it seems like it could be a good interactive tool if I understood what I was reading at all. But
I agree with you. I thought it was really impressive to be able to see all that had already been done, and it gave me a certain level of confidence that we could have some scenarios or some ideas, and that they knew what was going on in the rest of the Bonita area to make judgments for us. That because it's all very
I think that
complicated.
it's a good framework for modeling the specific sub-basins, if you will. And of course, as we've just talked about, we have to be aware of where we're at in the 300 square mile watershed, but it's still good to have that level of specificity for the city, within the city limits of our structures and flowways.
Yeah, and it tells us that if we do allow, if we were to recommend to the city that they were to allow some land use change in the DRGR, where that water would be headed towards, and what the capacity was to handle that, or not to let it go that way. So it was nice to see it was already mapped out and we didn't need another study. Okay.
and with that, I apologize. I have a commitment that
Understood.
was previous to the task force starting, so I'm going to excuse myself.
Fred?
Well, the one thing that I found a couple things that was interesting about the 2010. Number one, the city is actually the one that designated the areas that were really worked on and studied. And then the other thing was that I found another, what would I call it, anomaly, inconsistency between what the Bracco report said and what the 10 report said. And in the 10 report, they indicate that there was one area, virtually a small intersection. There was 12 minor projects that were done in there, and it said based on reports from the city there has not been any flooding. That appeared over in the Bracco report is there were 12 projects done, and there was no attempt to identify that this was a little tiny area, a hot spot, for lack of a
And
better.
Fred, what part of the study, or what part of the 2010 report was that mentioned?
Here, it's on page 8-1. I actually did a cut and paste, so I can give you this copy here. I've got some notes on it, on the back of it, so either that or we'll make a copy.
No, that's okay, as long as I know what page what you're looking in.
Yeah, on the top, you're talking about the 010, I said 8.1,
Right.
8-1.
Where it says a total of 16 potential flood-prone areas.
Yeah, and then on down in there, it talks about that there was a dozen projects done, and I've got to cut and paste. I'll copy it after the meeting, give you the page.
I don't need any more paper, I'm good. I just wanted to
Oh,
understand where you were talking about. Thank you.
Okay. I think they did a good job. I think that we probably, from what I got from the city engineer, that even though there's projects been identified, even though these are, for the most part, not all of them fall into that. Like Imperial Harbor was a bigger size problem area. We haven't been able to get the funding to do as many of these projects as we hope to do, which is always going to be a problem,
Right.
I think they did a good job, and in fact, I would propose that would be good if we scheduled Interra in so we can hear a presentation by them and be able to ask them questions as well.
In what regard? I mean, I think I'd rather hear from the city to hear what, have the city back to hear what parts of this have been implemented. And I had a question on their budget.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if Interra would be able to answer that or
It could be
the
a
city, so I don't know.
combination. Maybe you could have a combination of both or whatever, but, I think more information presented would be a good thing.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to have Interra here, but I don't know what scope you want. What part of the study you're looking for more information? I was curious about what's been done. I don't know what part of the study you're curious about to see whether it makes sense to have the city answer it or.
There's another area in there where they identified 6 project areas that were identified was 8, and then they had 3 bolded, and then they indicated that the only ones that were modeled were the 3 that were bolded. And I was puzzled as why those were modeled and the others weren't. Just some regular, what you call, interesting questions that I'd like to ask them, but it's not a big deal if we don't get them.
And I think, okay. I think the city might answer, because maybe it was a cost issue.
Yeah.
And so, okay.
I could also put them in writing and give them to John, and he could send them to him.
Right. Okay. And is it something Matt Feeney would be able to answer?
I'm sure, as
Okay.
to implementation, sure.
Okay, all right. So maybe it makes sense to have Matt back just for, 15 minutes to bounce some questions off him on this study. So, anything else? On these, okay. Moving on. I buried my agenda. Future presentation schedule.
Well, if you'll bear with me a second, I kind of want to go through what I see for the next agenda and then the next couple of meetings and see if it lines up with your expectations.
Okay.
So at the next meeting on the 21st, we've got Lee County Natural Resources sending down some folks to talk to us about TMDLs and also potentially the NPDES program in general. The way I've left it off with county staff is the head of natural resources, Roland Ottolini, and I got to get together. And other than Karen, who we asked for specifically, I'm kind of relying on him to send down whoever else he thinks would be helpful. There has been some suggestions that since we are on the now shifting to more of the water quality issues, you already heard from Public Works last time about some of the water quality initiatives they're undertaking. So we'll have natural resources down. There's been some suggestion that I also invite DEP to maybe double up on the presentations for next time, but I didn't want to do that till I heard if that makes sense to you guys. And also to ask if there's anyone in particular at DEP you think I should reach out to, because frankly, I don't know who that would be. And I'd be starting fresh, and the meeting is only 2 weeks away. So if there's any suggestions as to who might be helpful at DEP, that would be great.
Is DEP the department that will be able to help us understand the impact of 700 wells and 750 wells and septics versus? That's a question that I think we haven't had answered yet, that I certainly have questioned, and Cullum has questioned also, as to kind of a balance of, would more development on public works have less of an impact or more of an impact than fewer, but they've each got a septic and a well? I don't know if any.
Audrey, would that maybe be Keith Kibbe, or who would be the,
That's the NRM, isn't it?
who would be?
Might even
the-
be not be DEP. That's somebody I'd like to hear from.
Yeah, actually,
sure
we
who
did a
the-
little research early on with Department of Health, and I think they referred us over to DEP as the people to talk to about wells and septics. And
Okay.
I've got some contact people that I'll reach out to. I just
Yeah.
didn't know if
I'm
this
not sure
group
who.
was
I don't know anybody.
more plugged into one
I
person in
don't know that, but
particular.
I think on the TMDLs, you know, that's we need to get whoever's involved with
That
that
would be
current
Karen
study.
Well,
Bickford.
that's
Oh,
that's
okay.
from the county
At the
side.
county, though, or
Right.
the
Well,
DEP?
Yeah.
she used to be with
No?
DEP.
Oh,
but
okay.
She was in charge of that program here for quite a while, and I think she'd be the expert, I think.
He does TMDL, that's
Yeah,
Mhm.
requirement.
Mhm.
Jennifer Carpenter is the person.
oh, yeah. Wasn't Karen Bickford in charge of that for a
Well-
while?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Is-
And
is-
But TMDLs is a state.
state program, yeah, yeah.
None
Well,
of this is getting
whoever-
on the record, folks, so.
Well, what Phil said, Jennifer, is she from Tallahassee, though? So it might, no, okay.
Jennifer Carpenter, she heads up all the water quality for DEP in the Fort Myers office.
Oh, great, okay.
Great.
And TMDLs and basin management action plans, they are a state requirement handled by DEP. Karen is great. She represented Lee County on the TMDL
Yeah.
BMAP, but for the county, all the cities had someone there as well. But DEP is the one that's responsible for the TMDL program, and Jennifer Carpenter is probably the best person
So
to
we'll-
contact.
we'll have more input from the county side. Hopefully, I'll be able to work something out with DEP, but again, it's only a 2-week turnaround, so
I think on the county, it would be good to know if it's Roland Ottolini, what have they, whether it's water quantity or quality, what have they done within that 83,000 acre DRGR that would be impactful or helpful, or projects or
well,
improvements?
since you've heard from Public Works about what we're doing at the very local level, I'm assuming that everything we're going to be hearing from county is going to be on a much wider
Yeah.
scope. So those will be the double up on the presentations. We'll also be asking you to complete your homework assignments on studies C, D, H, O, and R and your inventory.
Say that again, please.
Say it again.
C, D, H, O, and R.
The first one was D-Dog?
C.
C is in cat,
C. okay.
Charlie.
D is in dog.
Cat, Dog, Hotel, Oscar, and Romeo.
And for those of you who don't have your old agenda in front of you, that's the Basin Management Action Plan for in the Everglades West Coast Basin, the Imperial River TMDL study, the Bonita Springs Stormwater Master Plan Phase 2, Irwin's Ecological Memo prepared for the lead DRGR study, and the 10-mile canal filter marsh presentation. Those are all online. Now, also what I've heard is that we don't necessarily need to go back and do a whole lot more on the studies that you didn't get to in detail today, but I will see if Matt Feeney's available to answer some questions about Study G.
That would be great.
Okay? Going forward, we also reached out to Eric Livingston about a presentation. The bad news is, though, that he won't be available until mid-June at the earliest because of scheduling issues. So I'm open to suggestions to further May presentations. We can call back some of the folks that you've heard before, or you can send me your
I
ideas.
still
on-
would like to hear from somebody from DOT in regards to future road plans, et cetera, and the type of traffic that's going to be expected from the East Bonita land that's all, or properties that are being built right now, and this Logan extension, Santa Barbara extension that's coming up.
And their maintenance plans, because a lot of the studies indicate when there's a problem with maintenance, it's DOT's problem.
The other thing is that I'm curious about is some of these, I know they're more expensive to just build roads, but an pervious road, or roads that have some elevated areas that allow some water to flow under, what are the?
I think DOT could answer some of that.
Right, so I think DOT would be great to hear from.
We were gonna hear from the mine, I think, within the next
Right.
month.
Right, they need it, right, he needed 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah, I think the mine is probably a little further back.
Right.
And then,
So I've got DOT rather in May, and
I think we were gonna bring back, well, of course, the BSU and the district, whether we brought them back in the same, we're gonna bring them back at some point.
luckily, because of their great cooperation with us, it sounds like they're going to be here or have representation at just about every
Pretty much
meeting,
every
so
meeting.
we'll call them up when we want to.
And perhaps Mr. Irwin will have more information by then and could let us know if he's found anything in these empirical data on this.
Why don't we plan on asking Kevin to come back then at the second May meeting, if that makes sense?
So what's that, about a month from now?
About a month?
Yep.
We had, 60 days on this work, so whatever the or the pre-final review of that might be.
I don't want to rush Kevin, I mean, it's,
Very good. I think I've got my marching orders.
we're good, all right. So, member items and reports,
Yeah, may I-
please.
Yeah, I'd like to thank BSU for the prompt response and complete response on the aquifer questions I asked. Thank you very kindly. And I also think I have some other questions percolating in my mind. I just haven't written them down yet. And I've also found very useful the South Florida Water Management District flood it out. This was helping looking at the aquifers. So you should all have a February copy of this. So thank you, BSU.
Thanks, Dave. Staff updates.
In your packet, I included 5 different items, and just to go through those for people who may not be aware of what was in the packet, we had the PowerPoint from Public Works from the last meeting. All of these, by the way, are either already posted on the website or in the process of being posted on the website. We've had some difficulty with the PowerPoints, frankly, because of size, but we're working on that. I also included, for informational purposes, the comp plan information that Audrey's working on with community development on water supply. The correspondence back and forth between Fred and I on a list of requests he had for further information, just so you know kind of what's out there and what's moving around, the pieces of the puzzle we're trying to put together there. I did include, and this was my decision, so if there's any heartburn about this, I'll take it. I did include a written handout that was given by Kathy McGrath to the City Council at their last meeting on her comments about the work of this group. And frankly, the only reason why I did that is because I thought it was helpful for this group to know what was actually put down in writing and given to the council that you're going to be reporting to at some point. So it seemed to make sense that if you weren't aware of it, to include it in your packet. It was nothing greater or less than that was my intention. And then the last thing I have in there was Audrey gave an opinion to Councilman Lockhart and the rest of the council by extension on a question he had raised about referendums and process going forward. So again, I thought that would be helpful for the group to know what the council was seeing.
Right, and maybe Audrey, it makes sense for you to just talk briefly about that comp plan amendment for Citrus, it's Citrus Park, correct, and it's required?
Well, it's not Citrus Park, but Citrus
Oh,
Park
I'm
is
sorry.
part of the question. It's okay, it's part of it. And let me go through. First of all, there's a series of state statutes, and you should have received the memorandum April 1st, and it was not an April Fool's. Okay, I wasn't sure if it's in the backup or you received it independently. So with concurrency in mind, we're required to have a water plan. And we're blessed that we really didn't need to do much changes to it, but there were some good changes. One is we removed the Glade Haven facility. So if you're Cullum Hasty or Torrey, I'm sure you guys remember that wonderful, that was bad sarcasm, that facility. So that's probably a good thing.
Was that the lavatory program they were talking about earlier?
Probably, yes. The only independent facility that, and by independent I mean somebody other than BSU, is now Citrus Park. Now, in most of Citrus Park's information was obtained because they did put in a South Florida Water Management District water use permit. So staff was able to take their data from the South Florida Water Management District. Remember, the purpose of a comp plan is not regulatory. The purpose is concurrency, to show that we are concurrent. So the data we have is what we took from what the regulatory agency was being shown. It showed that since the last update, there were 2 new BSU water storage facilities that were put in place, one at Windsor Road and the other on Snell Lane. There was update of existing data, population changes, there was existing water management district permitting. So the projections going forward, because again, it's an update, so like any of the updates, when you go from 2010 to 2020, you update those years, and that's all projected out. It was not me who did the math. And we did do some changes because we had 1/3 people and things like that, so we did round up or round down to the actual population. Revisions to concurrency, the state of Florida changed the Growth Management Act substantially. I believe it was 2012. So we needed to make it up to date. I still call it DCA, but it's not been DCA for a few years. It's DEO. And we also talked about one of the 9J5 areas, and 9J5 is gone. And then it also, and this is a good thing, you'll see in the water supply CIP projects, you'll see that those were modified, mainly because some of the projects, and that was some of the things you talked about today, some of the programs that the council has had on their CIP were completed. So that was modified and removed from there. This is a mandatory, so we are required, as soon as the Water Management District does it, we have an 18-month window, and we are at our 18-month window. It does say the work plan at a minimum, so if there are any suggestions, obviously, if it's not something, if it needs data supporting to come up to that conclusion, we can always do another amendment. This amendment does not count towards our annual quota of amendments. Any developer will know that usually we're restricted in how many times we can send amendments to DEO. And this is one of those where we can amend freely whenever, as long as we have the data supporting it. I mean, we're not going to just do amendments for fun, I hope. So that's basically the purpose of this. If anyone has questions, I'll be happy to answer, but of course I can't answer technical. I'm limited.
But for purposes of the task force, it was informational, maybe seeking some input.
Well, at this point, Thursday, it's going before the local planning agency. So if you really have input, you need to bring it over to the local planning agency, who is the entity who's actually charged by statute to do this review, and is charged by statute to make sure it's done, as well as to city council. And those dates are April 16th and also May 7th. So April 16th begins at 9:30. May 7th, I'm sorry, begins at 5:30. So if anybody, and it's a comp plan, so it's not as if you didn't come to the first reading, we won't entertain it for the second. We can certainly, if there's changes and council agrees with those changes, we can make it at the second meeting. So hopefully that helps y'all.
It does. Thank you. Does anybody have any plans to, or want to take on any suggestions as the task force? Crickets. All right.
It's really LPA's function.
Perfect. Thank you. That's it. We're adjourned.
I'd like to pass out just a couple things that we don't need to discuss. This is just information on the Pine Lake and the Hidden Cypress Preserve that we talked about just off their website.
Do I have copies?
I want to come around for you.
For me.
And then the other one is just, again, no action, just, we were talking about notes from the minutes of the February 3rd. These are just my notes from that are added. Sorry, February 3rd, that are added to Fred's, and I put mine in red so that, again,
Two
just
more,
notes.
This one is,
It's the same.
that's the same. Oh, it's the same as that. Here's this.
That one.
You have that one? This one here? This one is.
that one. So I should probably leave these for Nicole.
Oh, that's a good point.
So these should be for Nicole. Dennis, would you mind giving these to Nicole next time?
No, that's fine. Then go ahead.
Well, how do you want to do that, John?
Oh, you can, I guess.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to know what section
Yeah.
you were looking at. So
Adjourned.
No, I'll get it, I'll get it. I've got
He
it.
adjourned it.
Definitely not.
For Nicole
Right.
that she wasn't here, so.
Okay.